So, again, thank you all for being here. We've got a beautiful day. We'll get you out here in the afternoon so you can get back to your farm or whatever you want to go do. Want to give a big thanks to SOREC for hosting this event. Thank you, Rick, thank you, Andy, and thank you, SOREC, for allowing us to use this space. It's a great space for these type of meetings. We really appreciate it. The ability to use this has been handy and really critical to extending culture programming here in the Valley, so thank you. Also to Live, of course, for sponsoring this event. This is a live talk. I think this is the first live talk in Southern Oregon outside of the Willamette Valley maybe. And we're happy to have Live down here today, bringing some quality speakers to our growers. And before I introduce speakers, I'd like to also thank OBSRP for sponsoring the series of live talks that's been being held throughout the year, and Pacific Crest Vineyard Services for providing our coffee and bagels this morning and some support for this programming. Thank you. That's Randy Gold and Jason Cole, if you don't know them. And Jason Coates and Chris Hubert are with RP and OBS, so those four gentlemen there. Also, just take a quick moment to acknowledge Abby Cullinan, who's sitting right in the middle of the room. Abby works for Live, has done tireless work for Live for as long as I've been involved with Live, and Abby, unfortunately, for those of us in the program in viticulture, will be leaving Live, and she will be missed, but please, if you have any questions after Al fills you in on Live, know that Abby's here and you can talk to her about Live. So with that, we've got three presenters today. Dr. Paul Jepsen from OSU. He's the Oregon State IPM Coordinator. He's here on behalf of the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership to talk to us a little bit about what's going on with pesticides here in the Valley. They're kicking off a new program. It's an existing program, but they're kicking off some work down here in the Rogue Valley. So he's going to fill us in on that. Then we've got Dr. Houston Wilson up here from UC Berkeley. Drove up yesterday. Thank you for coming, Dr. Wilson. He's going to be speaking to us about some cultural controls of leafhoppers. And then we've got Al MacDonald here from Live. On behalf of Live, he is one of the founders of Live. And he's going to be filling us in on some of the program standards and how those are created and giving us a general overview and taking your questions about the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jepsen. And again, thank you all for being here. It's great to see you. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everybody. Hope you can all cope with the Corvallis accent. Thank you. Slide is appalling on there. It's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. Okay. I can give Houston a talk. So is it a great day for spraying, or isn't it? If you're applying pesticides, good day for a spray? No, worst possible day for spray. If you want to get pesticides in the stream, this is the day to choose. It's absolutely perfect. Why is this perfect for the most likely conditions in your area that would lead to pesticides entering surface waters? Because it's really still. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today are some of those simple rules you can follow to avoid chemicals ending up in the stream and staying where you want them to be. So as well as having a perfect calibrated sprayer and aiming the spray at the foliage, not undershooting, not overshooting, you never, ever, ever spray on a still day. You just simply don't do it. You stop doing it. And then you think about the days and the times in the week ahead when you've got an opportunity to treat. And always in this area, in those weeks you have, because of the lovely weather down here, compared even to where I come from in the north of the valley, there are days and times when pesticide application can be done safely and it can protect aquatic life. I'm going to show you some simple ways to access that type of information. We're working closely with Rick Hilton and others on kind of giving you that support that you require. And the state has provided us with funding to deliver what's called a decision support tool, something you can go to on your iPhone or Android device or Rick's website and say, when are the best times to spray in the week ahead? But one of the purposes for being here today is just to talk about this idea of focusing on aquatic life and salmon and the things that we want to protect and preserve, as well as encouraging economic activity and the growth of your industry. There's 10,000 farmers in Oregon, of which you are about 25, I guess. And we reach about 3,000 to 5,000 of those a year through our program, and indirectly, I guess, have some contact with all of them. And so some of the things I'm sharing today have an overtly educational purpose, and it'll be about application management. And there's an English and Spanish kind of guide here for the things I'll be talking about, like that little opening question. And so bear with me, and I'll try and take an hour or less. So give me fair warning when I've got 10 minutes to go. Gladly answer questions. And but I wanted to start off talking about what a pesticide stewardship partnership is from the perspective of a farmer or a grower, whatever you like to call yourselves. Because pest management is an enormous challenge. And then, of course, someone's telling you that some of the chemicals that you and other groups are applying are ending up in the water in the valley. Why is that? How could it occur? And then how do we work in a program like this to help improve your pest management at the same time as we assist you with good application practices? And so everybody wins as a result of doing one of these programs. So that's what this will be about. So, I mean, IPM can seem overwhelming, and actually I looked at this list today and I thought, my goodness, most of this could apply to wine grapes, it could apply to hay, it could apply to other pears, other commodities and groups we're working with. We're working with right-of-way maintenance people as well, although they have very strict application management guidelines that would mean they're not going to apply on a day like this. But if we look at, here's an example, it's actually for Christmas trees. This is a group we've worked with in the Clackamas Basin. So here we have early season treatment around now, okay, for a pest that's critical for quarantine. If you've got this pest associated with your Christmas trees and you try to cross the California border, export to Hawaii or send your trees to Hong Kong, the trees are rejected. You lose any potential for gaining income and you sell them in the local marketplace through Homebase or something. So this is a critical pest for Christmas tree farmers that I'm going to tell you about. Application conditions around this time of year are conducive to drift and runoff into streams, and so and then further in the North Valley we have different weather conditions at this time of year that drive the spray with different kind of weather forces. The pesticides are legally registered. We assume the spray is brilliantly calibrated. You know what nozzle to choose and how to aim it at the tree and all of those things that are actually, you have to remind yourself every time before you go out spraying. But somehow they've ended up in the water, and you've got a pesticide stewardship partnership watershed, and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is sharing that information with you so you can take voluntary measures to limit the likelihood pesticide will enter the water. But then the pesticides you've got registered end up killing natural enemies as well as the pest. And that's okay, you control your pest early on. But then those natural enemies are going to eat aphids that land on your trees later in the spring. And so you end up with an aphid outbreak, which covers the Christmas trees in honeydew. And it gets wonderfully complicated, this. The bees in the valley leave the hot conditions, fly up to where the Christmas trees are and where the vineyards are in the summer. And if there's honeydew around, they forage on the honeydew as their source of sugar. And so the Christmas tree farmers are spraying the aphids outbreak that was caused by treating early that killed off the natural enemies. And when they treat the aphid outbreak perfectly legally, there's no restriction on the use of these products because of the presence of bees, they end up with hundreds of thousands of dead bees under the Christmas trees. They don't want that to happen. So they come to us saying, how can we solve this? And by the way, these chemicals are ending up in the water in the Clackamas watershed. And we say, well, we're actually, the aphids we're worrying about, but we need to go all the way back to March and work out how we can manage those sprays early on. And so the industries want to protect their market. They don't want this nasty pest to be there. They want to manage the pest. They want to protect natural enemies and preserve bees. You know, and that's reconciling all of those things is kind of really difficult, but it's what we're very good at. It's how working with an industry, Oregon State University, Extension, other partners operating together can come up with a great result. So here's this nasty little pest is called the Douglas fir needle midge. You know, do you think there's much Douglas fir in Oregon? It's not just Christmas trees, is it? This little insect has been around for eons, and it likes eating the trees which we cut up, chop up and stick in our front rooms in the end of the year, through some ancient ritual that we've adopted and appropriated for our own celebrations. And so, you can remove heavily infested trees in the fall, for example. Christmas trees are actually cut in the fall, of course, but there you go. You can take on late budding cultivars. This is what an IPM program looks like, some of these key features. I'm not going to go into all of that today. But then you can actually track the adults as they're emerging from the soil in the spring. Little cardboard box covered in plastic with a plastic tube sticking out of it. The insects fly into the cardboard box from the soil, and there's some daylight there, so they jump into the tube, and there you are walking past this little tube, and you see the Douglas fir needle midge in there. It's not, it is more difficult than rocket science, I guess, but not much more. And then you can use a model, actually, based on the weather pattern to time when you put those traps out. And you say, well, why would I need to do that? I just stick them out in March, okay. Well, the weather's a little bit variable and unpredictable at the moment. The climate is changing, and last year they emerged 23 days earlier on average than they've ever done before in history. So it's good to use weather forecasts. And so we've worked on building a decision support process for those farmers that has them look at the weather and work out what will happen to this little insect. And there's various other things you can do, including relying on parasitic wasps, which Houston's going to be talking to you about. You talk about parasitoids, won't you?
Yes.
So please pay attention to him also. And because parasitic wasps are in your vineyards now, searching around for things to parasitize, and you just may not know they're there. But the chemicals you use against Douglas fir needle midge are all incredibly broad spectrum pesticides. There's no selective or narrow spectrum pesticides available. If you're going to spray, you're going to kill natural enemies. So the IPM thing here is minimize the amount of spraying you ever do, and if you do spray, make sure it's efficacious so you don't need to treat again. And there's lots of lovely stories about what the male Douglas fir needle midge hang around in groups, somewhat akin to their human counterparts. And they wait for the ladies' flies to turn up, and then certain things happen on warm nights that lead to Douglas fir needle midge juveniles doing their naughty things on the Christmas trees. And so what you do is you wait for a warm night after the model, the phenology model we call it, has indicated when you might need to spray, and if you spray on the day that's leading up to that warm night, those males that are looking for a party and end up having their expectations frustrated. So that's really what's behind this process, and it's driven by concern about pesticides in the water. It leads all the way back to this. So here we have parasitic wasps of the type that Houston's going to be talking to you about. Gastrancystrus and Platygaster, remember those, note the spelling. And they're tiny, tiny little things, but these parasitize the Douglas fir needle midge. But parasitic wasps, adults, and parasitic larvae lie within the needle midge. The red indicates here that if you apply any of the three products registered against needle midge, you get more than 75% mortality. And predatory bugs and predatory mites are also very important predators in Christmas trees. Also, other than perhaps a little bit less susceptibility with this chemical laws ban, you end up with high levels of mortality. So only spray when necessary, but you have to protect your trees. Encourage natural enemy populations on their farm. That's Houston's entree there. I'm his straight man, basically. He's the main act. So they can reinvade after treatment. If you have to apply, make sure you've got resources there that will draw natural enemies back into the field, because if you kill 3/4 of them, you're going to end up with a pest outbreak. Then you increase the likelihood of a later outbreak if natural enemies are killed, and you also risk bee kills. So very early sprays might not interfere with parasitoids that emerge later on. So sometimes there are insects that aren't around in March that occur in June or July, and they're kind of not affected by that spray, but we need research to work that out. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides here. My colleague Len Coop, in IPPC, that Rick and I have worked with for a very long time, has developed what's called a degree day model. And if you go to our website, it'll know where you are. It tells you where your nearest weather station is. And you just press this button, calc, and it tells you what the the timing of emergence is going to be for Douglas fir needle midge with the weather station that's closest to your Christmas tree farm. And so if you live slightly uphill, the weather's cooler, the emergence time tends to be days or weeks later than if you've lived downhill where the weather's warmer and the flies emerge faster. And so there's a distribution of more than a month of emergence times in our valley, and it's essential to use this model to guide your particular practices. No longer look downhill and say, oh God, Charlie down the hill is spraying, so I need to be doing that, which is a little bit of a habit that we've got into in Oregon. And that altitudinal change results in it not being the right time for you. Then the reason one puts out these traps, cardboard box, plastic tube, insects in tube, the reason you put those out is that the number of the flies go through cycles. So in 2010, only 2 flies were caught in 20 Christmas tree fields. 2009, 47 fields, more than 500 flies. I know there's more fields, but there's a heck of a lot more flies. So basically, you use the model to tell you when the insects are going to be around, and then you use the cardboard box to tell you if there's enough of them to warrant spending the money on a spray. And if you follow all of these things, then you end up spraying a lot less. And the record we've got in the pesticide stewardship partnerships is we often get like an 80% reduction in broad spectrum pesticide use because the uncertainty that you have as a decision maker is reduced because you get more information that you need at the time when you need it. And this is a complicated summary of all the things we're doing in Christmas trees. But Douglas fir needle midge using that model, avoiding risk of drift to avoid contaminating surface water. You're going to get something about that from me in a few minutes. Monitor aphids, for example. Only treat when necessary to minimize risk to natural enemies. For aphid management, you can use pesticides that aren't toxic to natural enemies. You've got some choice, and we provide the growers with guidance on which chemicals are toxic to natural enemies and which are not. Some of the ones that are not toxic to natural enemies are rather expensive, and you have to take into account where are your values, what do you want to be doing there, but at least we're providing you with that information. Then we recommend certain types of insectary plantings around the Christmas trees, and we've got a large amount of activity in that, and a new pesticide stewardship grant for the Clackamas watershed to put in natural enemy habitat. Houston's your man to tell you about that today. And then you can put in some edge or buffer plantings that can limit the spread of aphids into your crop. And then you can also release natural enemies as an alternative to emitting a pesticide. So all of those things added together, you think, my goodness, that's difficult. This is what life for a farmer is like. You're making decisions like this all the time. And if you're in a culture, you've got a new industry here, and I don't know what all your different backgrounds are, but in a kind of farming culture, it's kind of decision making, having the information you need to make a decision on the fly when you're absurdly busy, and you just have to have confidence that you're doing the right thing. Now, growth in use of these models that I'm talking about has absolutely skyrocketed since our weather became more unpredictable. So the more unpredictable our weather is, which has really started since about 2003-04, the use of these phenology models has now risen to about 600,000 uses a year. And so if you want to know the climate's changing, check out the use of these models, because when things are no longer predictable, you go to something that's going to help you with a forecast. Oh, I was spray on May the 15th, and I go on holiday on July the 4th, and I get in a nice spray in the last week of June. Well, the meaning of that spray now is completely different to what it was last year or the year before or 10 years ago, because the weather's different, your crop's more advanced or less advanced. And So use of weather forecasting tools is becoming we cannot keep up with the equipment capacity that's needed to meet the demand for the use of these models. And so like we're doing with an initial meeting this afternoon, and my colleague Mary at the back there, and Rick, and possibly some of you, representatives of other industries, we're getting together today for something somewhat akin to this, where these are Christmas tree growers, and this is Chow Landgren, an extension agent. And we talk about, what life would be like if we could manage the pests and limit impacts of entry of pesticides to surface waters and also protect fish, because we've got those dual goals. And then we work with farmers in the fields by developing a program that's been jointly conceived. We agree together what the plan is. We don't do that kind of separately. And I've started the ball rolling here, by the way, with a communications strategy by doing an interview on Jefferson Public Radio last Friday. I don't know if any of you heard that, possibly not, but you can go to a link and find it. And we're not going to be talking about the fact pesticides are in the water for quite a long time. What we would want to talk about eventually is how we've stopped them being there any longer. And that's going to be a real kind of success story, and it works for this is the way these things operate. But our idea of working empathetically with you on communicating what's being done to kind of make progress together is very much part of our kind of broader strategy. So please check that out. But in this case with the Christmas tree growers, we agreed this process. And then 1 year after a set of workshops were carried out, there was, and we work with nursery producers too, and that was a rather recalcitrant industry with regard to taking up IPM, and they're very much sold on this now, and the very high adopters. Christmas tree industry is, again, very slow to come to the table, rather conservative, rather kind of backward-looking historically. Now, biological control is their thing. I've never, in my life of working all the way around the world, this is the industry that is most seeking biological control now. They're almost leading in Oregon. So for kind of more environmentally conscious agriculture, and not just applying sprays willy-nilly any longer. And so we had about 50% uptake of use of online weather forecasting. About 80% of people said they took notice of what the weather forecast told them. About half adjusted an application at some point to protect a sensitive site. And about a third of them used less of this pesticide that's most toxic to salmonids. And so as part of our pesticide stewardship partnership in the Clackamas watershed with a whole group of other organisations and coordinated by the Department of Environmental Quality, who you've been hearing from, here's the record of this chemical concentration in the water from 2005 onwards. And this bar indicates the average concentration. The little dotted line here is the chronic standard here, because what happens is baby salmonidae lose their capacity to evade predators when they're exposed to that concentration of chlorpyrifos in the water. It's a minute concentration, absolutely minute. And nanograms, or micrograms per litre basically, which is a millionth of a gram per litre. It's a tiny amount. If you think of those crazy stories like one blade of grass in 20 football stadiums, that this is the type of concentration we're talking about. I haven't got an analogy for you, I'm afraid. So here's the frequency of detection in streams in the Clackamas watershed. And in 2014, after that education program, and we've just had the 2015 results, and there's a little bit detected now, we think less than before, we don't have the official results yet, but chlorpyrifos disappeared that year. Now, you can't say that our program was completely responsible for that, but the pests are as crazy as ever, the data sprays as much as ever, but just taking care, following simple rules, and building more IPM into your program has proven to be a very effective process. And now, biological pest control is the thing that attracts large numbers of Christmas tree growers to our events. We're going to do another one next week, and how do we do it? Which plants are we going to plant? What parasitoids and pests in predators should be looking for? That's become the kind of name of the game. And many of these natural enemies, like the parasitoids that Houston's going to be talking about, I mean, they may be messy eaters. You might think it's rather inhumane to have parasitoids controlling your insects as opposed to pesticides, but this is this is the food chain. This is the building an ecologically based system where chemicals are no longer interrupting the ability of these organisms to limit pest numbers. And that's really one of the goals of pest management, but also it has within it the kind of essence of a sustainability, which you all want, of course. And so we've got an elaborate program on building conservation biological control, which some of you might hear about in the future. But you might say, well, why is this relevant to me? You know, and we don't know which applications are responsible for chemicals ending up in surface waters here, and none of you would apply any pesticide with the intent of doing that. It's just rather, it does happen. And so what I did yesterday was I looked at the chemicals that have been found in the surface waters in the Middle Rogue that are also applied to wine grapes in this area. And it's a longer list than this. There's one that I'm still following up on. But glyphosate is effective against annual and perennial broadleaf weeds and grasses. Casseron is kind of fair. It's considered to be against these perennial and annual weeds, but good against fine fescue and bindweed. Acetyl-acetamiprid, a neonicotinoid pesticide, is effective against leafhopper, and leafhoppers do well down here, unlike in other wine grape producing areas. Carbaryl, Sevin, has been used, I believe, as a trunk spray and is referred to in a recent plan that your industry's put together. So it's considered to offer what's called good level of control. Direx and Carmex, Diuron, is effective against dandelion. Imidacloprid, these different product labels, there's many of those, again, toxic to mealybug and leafhoppers. And Goal is, again, good to fair against a whole range of the weeds that are of concern to you. So one thing there's the education program which we're intending to roll out will do is, when, why are you applying, what are the practices you can use to limit movement and redistribution. If you need to use these, they're less expensive, they're more efficacious, there's no alternatives. But let's look at what the alternatives are and how they stack up against these, and give you at least the decision support that you can make decisions saying, well, actually, I'm going to choose a different product at this time of year, or I'm not going to spray on that day any longer, I'm going to wait for these conditions to prevail, or I'm going to just try something slightly different, I might put in a buffer zone. Low cost, common sense, things to do, just supported by decisions. I can go back to this slide at the end, but I'm going to move on now to a little bit of application management, okay? But that's my kind of introduction, if that's all right, to why Pesticide Stewardship Partnership. This isn't, by the way, pointing a finger at anybody, any group or industry. It's what we've noticed in Oregon is it's quite easy to think, those people that grow trees up a hill are kind of responsible for this, or that industry, they get out their sprayers all the time, I think they must be to blame. It's the type of thing where, if everybody takes care with application management, and we include everybody in this kind of team effort, we don't compete with each other for who's responsible for something good or something bad. We work together, and with good application practices, all that pesticide in the water are kind of dollar bills floating in the water as well. If you overshoot your tree, for example, by 5 or 15% of your spray, that's 15% of those 300, 500, 1,000, whatever it is, dollars in that spray tank thrown away. So good application practices save money, you get greater efficacy, and it's good for the salmon too. So we take it from this kind of win-win approach. We're not trying to provoke any enmity between farmers who all have the same challenge in life, just different crops to grow. So this is an educational part now about application management, and I think you know this if you're certified applicators, but I'm going to review these weather conditions and show you something about the climate and weather here, and hoping that I'm going to be warned about time, Daniel.
Yeah, I'll take care of that.
Yeah, thank you. So, here's application with an air blast sprayer. People haven't set fires in these apple orchards here. You might think there's kind of a blaze occurring. This is basically really bad application, just awful. Just you should, this is an offence in Europe, of course, but it's not here. It's considered to be a sign of good economic activity. But you look around these hillsides, and you see these plumes of application occurring on a rather still day. So not only is there overshoot, you look at that, this is the size of the tree, there's the sprayer, that's what, 50% of the spray is shooting out. And all it does is these coherent packets of droplets, they don't evaporate because it's quite cool, the weather's quite still, so what do? They sediment gradually to the lowest point in the watershed. And what do you find at the lowest point in your watershed? A flowing stream. And that's where the stuff ends up. And so one of the major drivers for chemicals in surface water at this time of year is application to places that you get excessive, what's called inversion drift in still conditions. And you often can't see these droplets. I mean, this is rather generous application, high volume, and you're seeing them because there's simply so much volume in the air there, litres of pesticide floating through the atmosphere. But with a sprayer that's well adjusted, it's still happening. You just can't see those tiny droplets, and that's one of the things that you just have to accept. So I'm going to hand out at the end, so you're not distracted during the talk, an English and a Spanish guide that goes through the stuff I'm just about to summarise for you, all right? And it's like a cartoon. It's like, this is what you shouldn't do, here's the thing that's kind of okay. So if you have a windsock and the windsock's horizontal, that's telling you something. It tells you the wind direction and it gives you an indication of speed. And you can actually buy windsocks that are for pesticide application guidance, and you can even get one that clips onto your tractor that's at the height you're spraying, and it actually tells you the wind speed. And if it's above a certain level or below a certain level, you shouldn't spray, or spray inside the vineyard and have drift occur for like 15 rows, and then go in and do that other one later or at a time when the wind's built up. The wind, by the way, builds up for a window of time tomorrow, and you've got perfect application conditions based on yesterday's weather forecast for a little while tomorrow, and then the next few days are a little bit of a disaster. But the weather forecast might have changed, but it's very easy to find this out, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So wind drift, obviously, wind blows this way, and it ends up in the field boundary. So it's highest when the wind is above 9 miles an hour. 7 to 9 miles an hour. The risk of wind drift is greater if sprayers are poorly calibrated or if nozzles are worn. If a nozzle's worn, go home and change your nozzles if you've not done so for a year, is the best advice I can possibly give today. Forecast the weather, change your nozzles, mate, easy stuff. Excessive boom height, poor boom suspension, bouncing around, this occurring. If you're driving like at 3 miles an hour and the boom does this, that's like a 30 mile an hour redirection of the spray, and it pops up into the air and then does all those crazy things. So the right suspension, the right tyre pressure on the sprayer, whatever you're doing, all of those things make a difference. Spray in wind speeds of like 2 to 9 miles an hour, and when the temperatures are less than 70 degrees and that droplet and your setup on the sprayer will guide the spray to get some maximum amount of coverage that's achievable. Still not great, of course, the way we spray, but it's all right. Everything in moderation, which of course you're all brilliant at. And then consider having some kind of offset to protect sites that are downwind of the prevailing wind direction. I'll talk a bit about that in a few minutes. I'm going through these fairly quickly because a large amount is common sense, and it is summarised in here. Okay. What time am I aiming for, by the way?
9:30.
Right, so once I've been through this, we can have a few minutes discussion. Is that good? Thermal drift. So the spray comes out of your air blast sprayer at like 150 miles an hour. And you use water to mix the spray, not commonly. And those little droplets are travelling really fast. And within a foot of leaving the sprayer on a warm day, they're like 1/10 the size they were when they left the sprayer. And when droplets lose momentum, because they're losing mass, they get buoyant. And forces in the atmosphere overwhelm them and become so powerful that the convection currents can just carry the drops away. So, I mean, for those of you that, I always tell this analogy, for those of you that have a beard, I notice a few of you do, you cycle around the country lanes on a misty morning. Some types of mist, actually, the mist kind of parts in front of you as you're cycling, but you end up with little bits of misty droplets on your beard, and if you've got a kind of hairy woolen pullover or something, they catch up on that. So, the surface that's, I present quite a large surface area, and I've got a boundary layer of air around me, so when the little droplets are moving towards me, they kind of part and kind of move beyond. So if you've got a lightweight droplet moving at even quite high speed towards a vineyard, a vine trunk or branch, it could easily just simply go past it and continue if it doesn't have the right amount of mass to penetrate that surface layer. So I'm giving you a tiny bit of physics here, nothing painful. But it's incredibly easy to apply a spray, think you've got a good treatment, but less than 5% of the spray ends up where you think it needs to be going. And in the Columbia Basin, where it gets hotter and drier than here, the demonstration we do is you take out a little four-wheel drive truck with a spray rig on the back with fluorescent tracer in the spray tank, and after about noon from June onwards, the spray goes down about halfway to the wheat field and then just goes straight up into the air again. So those kind of demonstrations tell you about this phenomenon, thermal drift. And it's thermal drift and inversion drift that tend to catch people out in some of the violations that occur in the state. So this is a pretty disastrous spray because that air blast sprayer is, every single nozzle there is just so perfect, it's pumping out so much spray, but is it aimed at the tree? Well, no, I'm answering for you here, no. So, there's... need to explain that. So, there's a high risk of thermal drift when temperatures exceed 70 degrees and humidity falls below 40%. So use weather forecasts and spraying cooler conditions, which for many of you will mean morning or evening here, morning better. With air blast sprayers, target the tree, turn off the sprayer at row ends, spray inwards in the outer rows, turn off one rank of the nozzles. And moderate your ground speed, the nozzle flow rate and air speed. And there are ways to do this, depending on how your spray rig goes, how modern it is, and the degree of control it offers you. And there was, Rick's colleague Steve Castagnoli came here a few weeks ago and offered a sprayer calibration program, and that will be happening further with you, and that's one of the best things that can happen, and it's a really great idea. And you can use an unsprayed crop buffer, but it doesn't need to be that big. 10 yards is fantastic, but every row of vines you take out is an economic loss. So balancing those things in the places that are higher risk is part of what's worth considering, but it's not the whole story. Inversion drift. Here's fruit trees. This is a winter spray. No leaves on the tree. Not a great target. Still day, like we've got today. This is a March spray. Here's the tractor. There's the pesticide. Surely, here's the tractor. There should be the pesticide, not here. And this is purely because the convection forces are sufficient to carry that spray just to where it needs not to be. And this is Neil Creek, and Neil Creek was listed for chlorpyrifos detections, and for the past few years they haven't found any because of following a simple set of guidelines about when you spray, how you spray, calibrating the sprayer, targeting the tree. You can basically use a different type of nozzle here with large droplets in it, target the tree, don't aim it at the sun or the moon. Is this a religious ritual going on here? I don't know. And then, there's simple rules you can follow. Ideally, don't spray on a day like this, but if you have to, make the droplets so big that gravity is going to do that work for you. So inversions cause spray clouds to remain buoyant. They move large distances on air currents, so avoid cool, stable conditions with low surface mixing. If you're doing something that's creating eddy currents and mixing, you increase the velocity of the droplets. And in future education events or workshops or standing in your vineyard with your sprayer in front of us, you can just play around with how you use it, and you can create some turbulence and alter the characteristics of the sprayer, get the efficacy you want, but avoid some of this happening. And if you've got someone that sprays for you or a contract applicator, they tend to know this stuff, but they just, being aware that you're concerned about appropriate conditions, particularly in parts of your vineyards that are near to a stream on a slope where there's higher risk or more sprays going on, you can develop a strategy. So spray when there's some wind blowing. You need some wind to keep that velocity of the droplet high enough that its mass then carries it onto the surface. That's what's happening. That's why you're doing that. So general guidance, plan ahead now even. Where are the sensitive places near your vineyard? And so I'm also, Rick, you can put these slides onto your website if you wish, if anyone wants this, but it's also in these guidance notes here. So map the fields, consider the climate at different times of year. I'm going to show you your 30-year climate pattern as if we think our climate is the same as it was over the last 30 years. But anyway, I'm going to show you that. We're going to talk about application and drift management in a few minutes. Site buffer zones to intercept possible drift downwind from sprayed sites. There's only a few places probably in your vineyards where perhaps putting a buffer zone or a vegetated buffer would actually be a good idea. And you can work with the NRCS, I believe. I don't know if wine grapes fall into that group. But and the Soil and Water Conservation District to find an appropriate plant for something that would collect some drift. And invest in drift reduction technologies. Go and see your local nozzle expert. They'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know about nozzles, but you'll end up with the right nozzle if you tell them what you want. What they will not do in Oregon is say, we think you need this nozzle, because they don't know what your application conditions are like. They don't know how good your sprayer is. They can't guarantee a good result. So the better kind of people to help you in the points of sale in Oregon need you to tell them what your priority is, and then they'll guide you to the part of the store where the ceramic, the brass, the plastic, the type of drift reduction technology you're looking for. They'll take you to the right place. And if these things cost $1.50 or even $5 each, replacing those once a year isn't too awful. So seasonal drift risk, let's have a look at that. When in the year are the winds more than 9 miles an hour for wind drift? When in the year is the weather warm? You know that. When is the air stable? Let's have a look at some examples. So here's Portland, and the mean wind speed between January and December is quite high. The average wind speed is quite high. So it's a windier place than here. But if you look at the proportion of the time that you could apply a pesticide, it's about 30 to 45%. Of all the days of those months on average. So there's always a day in the week ahead when you can be sprayed. Always. But then you should be really cautious about a third of the time, like 2 days on average a week. And the hazardous conditions are about 10 or 12% of the time in the summer when most of the sprays go on, when it's really windy. So that's not so bad. It's like 1 day every 2 weeks or something. So for wind drift, there are days when you can spray. For thermal drift, the average temperature in June, July, August and September means that you need to be cautious about thermal drift. But at 10 o'clock in the morning, the average temperatures are lower, and it's only when you get to relative humidity, is kind of moderate, so that the droplets are not going to evaporate to become tiny so much. But in the afternoons at that time of the year, you need to be a lot more cautious. And then for a proportion of the time when there's an inversion happening, it's about 5 to 10% of the time, so it's not very common in Portland. It's a windier place. If you go to Salem, further south, you see what's happening here. The wind speed's going down, so there's less kind of overall hazard here. And so, in general, there's a slightly higher or somewhat the same proportion of the time where you can avoid wind drift by using a weather forecast and spraying on a less windy day. But the likelihood of an inversion's now gone up to 14%, which is significantly higher. And the humidity in the mornings is a little bit lower in the summer months, so you need to be thinking about avoiding thermal drift even in the morning. What do you think is going to happen in Medford? Is it slightly warmer here in the summer? Is it slightly stiller here in the summer? Is it slightly less windy here in the summer? Yes. So here, the average wind speed becomes rather low, and you're up to 50-60% of the time when it's okay to spray, and only 6-8% of the time when the wind drift is likely to occur. But for thermal drift, you're now looking at April through September, or even October as the months when you need to be cautious. And the relative humidity, even in the mornings, in the summer months, is such that you need to be very concerned about maximising droplet size, moderating speed, considering early in the day applications. And in the afternoons, like they do in the Columbia Basin, you should probably have a policy of not spraying. That's the easiest thing to do. And if you look at the proportion of the time that's calm, that's the killer. So in general here, choosing nozzles that have larger drop sizes is a good policy, because you get more efficacy, because those larger droplets are going to then evaporate to the droplet size that's perfect for the wine grapes. So Rick, colleagues, somebody might do some experiments to try out different nozzles in an experimental block. But the one recommendation I would do would be to find your local nozzle guru, find some characteristic types of sprayer that you've got, and find one that uses a drift reduction technology that gives us a larger drop size. So that, that's just kind of good advice looking at this. And you lovely people have just participated, or representatives of you, in a strategic planning exercise for IPM in wine grapes, which is about to get published by the USDA. It's a fantastic thing. And you'll share this as an industry, and everyone will say how wonderful you all are for having done that. And here are basically the times of year you're doing things like bird netting, cultivating, pulling leaves, mowing. But here's the pesticide application for powdery mildew, botrytis, and insects. You're probably doing weed management sprays at other times too. But if you look at this period between April and September, where most of those treatments are going on, there's possibilities for wind, thermal, and inversion drift in all of those times. So if we go back to this period, you see, there are, one day every, 2 to 3 weeks is going to be quite windy, and warm afternoons that are prone to thermal drift, with the possibility of also of still days happening in one of your main periods. So, that basically gives you an idea of, it reinforces the need to focus on climate and weather to get maximum efficacy for those sprays that you're obliged to apply. It's making sense? So, general guidance: use weather forecasts, buy equipment to measure wind speed and direction. Go to one of the hunting catalogues or whatever, and you can buy these wind speed meters now. You just hold them in the air, and it gives you a readout. Kestrel, I think, makes one, just fantastic. And just have it with you in the cab, and if the wind just absolutely drops, there's a strategy you could develop within the vineyard that stops pesticide moving beyond the vineyard. And you can even kind of slightly exploit drift somewhat to treat those outer rows that you're no longer going to drive past with your sprayer. So spray less sensitive areas on marginal days. If there's parts of the farm where a little bit of drift just goes into the next vineyard block, that's less of a problem than if it's a schoolyard or a stream. So just identify those places when the weather's a bit iffy that it's kind of okay to spray. And then only spray parts of field, or only spray parts of field that are upwind of sensitive sites. If the wind's blowing away from across the stream into your vineyard, you're never going to get drift taking the spray into the stream, because it's going to go the other way. So having a wind direction thing going on is with a windsock is very good. And just use less hazardous materials. Find out if there's an option that's going to be less mobile and less toxic. Increase drop size, lower ground speed, think about those different types of nozzle. Here's a property, here's a different type of crop. Ooh, imagine that's one of these crops that we're going to be talking about this afternoon that uses a herbicide that your grapes don't like. If the wind's blowing in that direction, talking to your neighbour about, well, could we have a windsock we share between us? And when the wind's blowing from my property to yours, it's really fine to spray because that wind's going to take things away. But if it's still and it's warm and you're treating with that herbicide that you like to use, you know, it's going to end up my place. And without us really understanding why that happened. So the wind direction, wind speed, conditions, very important. So here's an annual windrows for Salem, and this shows the direction the wind's coming from. So the wind on average through the year comes from the south. These are all the compass points, okay? And when it comes from the south, there are times when the wind is quite strong. It's strong wind out to the outside, weak wind to the middle. But then you look at the year as a whole, May, June, July, August, September, October, the wind starts off being westerly to southerly, then it switches to being northerly, and then it switches back to the south again. And you're in all of these different finger valleys, all of these beautiful places. You're all in unique climates and conditions. We can't come up with a general rule for Medford like I just did, and hope that applies to all of you. So having some knowledge of your local weather, just a little weather forecasting thing you have on the window with an anemometer on your rooftop, and then a windsock on the tractor or at a place where it's about the height of spraying you need the windsock to be, and just in a place where you can go out and say, well, what's the wind doing and where's it going? It's just, you just internalize this, you see it, you know where it was best to spray, it just becomes a routine. There are places you can get weather data, and I went to 2 of them yesterday. One is National Weather Service graphical forecasts. Write that into Google or on your phone and you get straight to it. And you can manage your application strategy using this. And there's 2 different versions of the map. There's the old-fashioned version, which is quite good, and I'm going to show you the new version. And it says on the website, do you want to see what this is going to look like in the future? You click on that link, and then you get a map that looks like this, where you can slide this bar along and look at what the wind speed or temperature is going to be doing in the 5 days ahead. And you can also zoom into Medford and find what's going on there. So this is for a slide I did in November. Not very good. But here are 2 slides for one for today and one for tomorrow. And what this shows is, I'm sorry you can't read this very well, but the wind here in eastern Oregon is 5% from the northeast today, 5 miles per hour. In the valley, it's 5 miles an hour from the north, 4 miles an hour. Here, it's 2 miles an hour, and it's too still to spray, really. Tomorrow, between about 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock, based on yesterday's forecast, which must have changed now, it's 4 miles an hour here coming from the northwest. That's great conditions for treating it. So using something like that, you can use this slider bar, move it along, and just simply say, oh, that sensitive site, when do you want to treat that? Tuesday afternoon. I'm going to treat all the other places before then, and I'm going to keep monitoring the weather forecast, and the sensitive site, I'm going to go when there's a bit of wind blowing. And then this is our website, uspest.org/WEA, and Rick probably has a link to this on his website already. Do you, Rick?
Not exactly.
Right. But so
You will have one.
One of the things that's going to happen through this program is we're just going to come up with better ways of communicating with you, not just your iPhones, but you can go to Rick's website and bam, perhaps there's a local Southern Oregon wine industry group where we can, what's called a mashup, we can send all these data to you and you can distribute that. But what this shows is here, the temperature profile. I know I'm at my time. And it shows the wind speed forecast, these little blips in wind in the afternoons in a few days ahead, and it shows the rain, which is going to be happening. So there are times when you can treat and times when it would be ill-advisable. So that's all I had to say, really. I wanted to end, well, if you use a drift reducer, if you put drift reducing nozzles on your air blast sprayer, this is the deposition rate from the 3 yards away from the edge of the field to 50 yards away of spray, expressed as a percentage of the application rate that you're actually applying in your vineyard. And here, this is German data, But this is with a drift reducing nozzle and a without a drift reducing nozzle. You can see you can radically reduce the amount by 75% the amount of drift if you just use a different type of nozzle. It's worth paying attention to. I'm just really going to finish with a link to Houston. Is this all right? 2 minutes more. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, you're fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots and lots of different types of natural enemy out there, not just parasitoids, these parasitic wasps. There's big beetles that eat things, there's hoverflies that lay eggs in colonies, there's lacewing larvae that feed on insects by injecting their mouth parts in and pushing in digestive enzymes, creating a soup and drinking it. It's all rather splendid. But these are very, very diverse array of organisms. Basically, this is a measure over time of natural enemies in your vineyard, say, or a pear orchard. And here's kind of pest numbers that start rather high when there's not many natural enemies around, and over years you get the natural enemies building up, and this density of pests is lower when there's lots of natural enemies around. Just what the world we want, okay? As many natural enemies as possible, minimum number of pests, and then you only spray when you need to. And then if for a reason you apply a spray and it kills the natural enemies, you end up with more pests. It's called resurgence or a flare-up, and it's incredibly common and we want to try and avoid it. Flare-ups basically happen when the toxicity of the pesticide to the predator is greater than the toxicity that it is to the prey, the pest. And unfortunately, many of the predators we have are incredibly susceptible to pesticides, more susceptible than pests for a variety of reasons. And so these things called flare-ups do occur, and it's something we talked about during the pest management and strategic planning exercise. And we want to give your group a rating of how toxic pesticides are to natural enemies, so it can help you guide your choices. How do insects get exposed? And you can dine out at parties on this crazy guy that's talking about this stuff. But I spent a part of my career working out how insects pick up pesticides. And although this isn't a predator, these are the footprints of a caterpillar. What it turns out is they go around doing this with their feet before they plonk it down. And as they're doing that, there's a field of droplets on the spray droplets on the leaf, and they're gradually mopping up the pesticide as they go. So they get more exposed to pesticides. And just to fascinate you further, the amount of pesticide they pick up is a function of how fast they walk, how wide their gait is, the track width, and a proportion of their foot area that lands on the ground. And yes, I worked this out for loads of natural enemies. And so here you have, scraping its backside along, that's what these marks are, and then the feet of a large beetle. Here's a slightly smaller beetle that where it makes less of a mark. So this beetle is small, it's more susceptible to pesticides, but because it actually picks up less insecticide in the field, it ends up surviving when the big one that's not very susceptible dies. So you get these counterintuitive things going on where you lose natural enemies that you didn't expect to lose because they got big feet and walk like this, And here's the balletic kind of mincing gait of a ladybug. It kind of goes along on tiptoe. And though ladybugs are the most susceptible to pesticides of these three natural enemies, actually, in the field, they survive a lot better than the big beetles do because they don't pick up as much. So when I look at pest sprayers, natural enemies, I've got this different view of what you're doing because it's, are those pests moving around? Where are they exposed on the leaf surface? How much are they picking up? And then I do these kind of, I've done historically, which I don't do any longer, these measures of how much insecticide actually deposits on pests and beneficial insects, if this is a wheat crop, on the ear of the crop versus the ground. So, if an insect's sheltered under a lot of foliage, it gets a lot less exposed to pesticide than if it's hanging around on the outside. So, aim the pesticide at the vineyard, the plant, where the pests are, the place where the pests are, you'll maximise the exposure of the pest, and the natural enemies that live in and around your crop are less exposed, so that's a good thing. And over time, well, the Rick's done exquisite work for a very long period, and you don't know about Rick's international reputation because he's the most modest person in Medford. However, this is the type of thing we do in IPM. We learn about these things and try and manipulate that understanding to maximise the benefits and minimise the risks. So, plan ahead, minimise risk drift. Please take this as our first contribution to the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership, and we're going to try and come up with a decision support tool that meets your needs, and we're going to be learning about that with a group of you today. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Jepsen. I think we've got a few minutes for questions before the next presenter. I had a question for you.
Yeah, good.
It sounds like we may want to be considering some nighttime or early morning spray applications, and I don't expect you to have the answers for this for us because it is so, as you said, site-specific, but it sounds like something we should be considering. And one of the interesting things we see here are these, with these inversions, in the evenings, in the mornings, we get these winds moving up and down
Right.
the wall. So maybe that's something that, as you develop these plans with the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership, we should talk a little bit more about.
Yes. One thing we could do is have you strategically place some weather stations as an industry and get those linked to our website, so you can find data that's much more local to you. Because have we got a second to go to the internet?
Sure.
Sorry, Houston. I'll give you 10 minutes, all right? Great. Where are we? Yes. Oh, if it's not connected, it doesn't matter. But shall I try it?
Give it a try.
US Pest, and then the website has to be operational, which we hope it is, /WEA. So what will happen is if you put that in, you get a screen that says quick start. You can put in your zip code and it shows you all the weather stations that are sending data from this area to our website. And in the pear growing area, historically we've had quite a lot of weather stations that have sent us data, and it may not be matching up to the area you're working in. So if you get somebody to install a weather station that can support your industry with pest management decision making, then nowadays that weather station talks to our system. And we are,
like the one here is the main, according to the director.
okay, well, perhaps that's suitable already. But we contact, every 15 minutes, we contact 32,000 weather stations around the country. So, I mean, we're absorbing data from those. And, yeah.
So a few years ago, there were several of the Davis weather stations that were put together.
Yes.
And I don't believe any of those are linked together. I don't know if
Okay.
that's something possible, but quite a few of the vineyards around here
Great.
have them, and we can pull up and see ourselves what different vineyards look like. But
Wonderful. So you can apply your own set of rules. We can also find a way of connecting to those. The idea is you're contributing that data for everyone to see, and that there's nothing kind of, it's the weather, it's not a secret, as it were, So, but then you get access to all the models and tools we've got if it links in. But this idea of an app that just says, where am I now, what might I be doing? Just don't forget that the wind speed and direction in different valleys around here can be completely different. So you just have to be very, very cautious and make this true for yourselves. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Unfortunately, you'll be seeing a little bit more of us. But you'll be incredibly excited to come to an application technology event. Incredibly excited soon. And we'll always try and get someone from Berkeley to do all the good stuff after we've done the other stuff. So that's an entree to Houston. But thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jepsen. Yeah, just like to invite up Dr. Houston Wilson, who's our next presenter.
I'll be at the back of the room preparing for this afternoon, but listening, so don't think I'm being rude.
Can everybody hear me? All right. So what I'm here to talk about today is some work that we've done with wine grape growers in Napa and Sonoma County over the past 7 years to evaluate the use of on-farm habitat diversification to enhance biological control of leafhoppers. And if I can find the clicker here. Thank you. So this was, we call this the UC Berkeley Vineyard Agroecology Project. This was initiated in 2007 with a number of wine grape growers in the North Coast region. We were approached by a small group of growers who were very interested in further developing and evaluating the use of flowering cover crops in their vineyards to enhance biocontrol. And this was their motivations were coming from they had a variety of motivations pushing this effort. Generally speaking, the future of a lot of their chemical control options were in question, of course, negative impacts of pesticides, product regulation, product efficacy with rising pesticide resistance of leafhoppers against certain products, of course, rising cost and consumer demand. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. Wine grape production in particular has this interesting component relative to other cropping systems in that you have consumers actually coming to the farm, coming to the tasting room, trying the product, looking out at the vineyard right then and there. You don't get this with carrots and onions, etc. And so, as much as possible, folks were wanting to reduce consumer drinking some wine, looking out in the vineyard and seeing this rig going around spraying some sort of product. So there was a big interest in getting ahead of any sort of pesticide regulation that these growers were anticipating. And they were very interested in the use of these, what we call ecologically based pest management practices. And there's kind of a wide array of things that we see people doing in, not just in vineyards, but in other cropping systems. Putting in hedgerows along the border of vineyards, even small little plantings of rose bushes at the end of vine rows. Here, of course, we have a flowering cover crop, both one between the vine row and then another one seated directly underneath. And growers were already experimenting with a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of guides that exist that are based on studies where we've gone around and collected insects off a variety of different non-crop plants, flowering plants in particular. And we found that, yes, a lot of these flowering plants do attract a lot of beneficial insects. So there's been some guides that have been put together by ATRA. There's another one here by CCOF in California. Hedgerows for California Agriculture, a resource guide. This is supposed to be this guideline that a grower can pick up and follow to implement some sort of on-farm habitat management program to ostensibly enhance biocontrol or conserve pollinators or a whole other variety of what we generally call ecosystem services. These are things that nature provisions to us humans and in this case to agricultural production in particular. The problem, of course, is that the findings are very general. It's really, we just know that good bugs come to these certain plants, and we assume if we put them out in the farm that that's going to have some sort of impact on pest populations. But in reality, it's a very, very context-specific sort of situation. And I'll get into this a little bit more here as we get into the talk. Brief review about how on-farm habitat can enhance suppression of pests. There's basically three main hypotheses. One, you put these flowering plants out there or whatever habitat, and it in some way enhances natural enemy populations. This is primarily by providing food in the form of nectar, pollen, or alternate prey and host that are found on that non-crop vegetation, or by providing habitat itself in the form of overwintering sites, refugia from sprays, etc. Alternately, rather than enhancing natural enemies, when you add non-crop vegetation into your farm, you may actually just be reducing pest colonization of the crop. So the habitat kind of acts as a camouflage for the crop, or you can even have a trap crop. This is olive trees in Sonoma County intercropped with grapevines. You can see how it kind of hides the crop a little bit, and this is known to make it more difficult for the pest to find the vine itself. And then finally, our third hypothesis here is that when you intercrop something with your primary crop, you are, of course, introducing competition. And so here's a really overgrown flowering cover crop on a pretty fertile soil. this probably isn't your ideal way to put flowers into a vineyard, and this is probably creating some degree of competition with the grapevine itself. And we know that pests will respond to changes in the vigor of their host plant in a variety of different ways. And we've seen in some cover cropping studies that the effect of the cover crop itself, it did lead to lower pest populations in the vineyard, but we realized that it was related to the competition the cover crop created with the vine itself. It was just reducing the vigor of the vine, rather than attracting a lot of natural enemies to the flowers, which then went on to parasitize or protein on the pest. So what do we know about this stuff? Is there any evidence that on-farm diversification, the addition of habitat into your vineyard, can actually enhance biocontrol? Yes, generally, and this is looking broadly across many studies and many different cropping systems around the world, we do generally, but not always, see a positive correlation between biodiversity and agro-ecosystem functions. So these are studies looking at biocontrol, pollinators, a number of these ecosystem services that I mentioned. But of course, the outcomes are very system specific. We don't really have a magic bullet. Something that works in corn production is not readily transferable to viticulture. And even something that may work in Southern California and wine grape production there may not be readily transferable to Northern California, much less Oregon. So the effectiveness of a lot of these on-farm habitat programs that have been developed today, they really depend on context, and they really need, therefore, to be developed on a case-by-case basis. This, of course, makes it very, very difficult. We can work this out in one region, and the scalability of it may be limited to a certain pest or a certain cropping region. So one quick example that I wanted to throw up here of what we would consider ecologically based pest management is the push-pull system that was developed in East Africa. A lot of farmers in Kenya, Uganda have adopted this. And this is basically where you intercrop corn with this ground cover. It's a legume in the genus Desmodium. And then fields at a certain point are surrounded by these large stands of Napier grass. And the idea is that the Desmodium, there's volatile chemicals that it give off that actually repel the stem borer pest of the corn. It repels it away from the corn crop. And at the same time, the Napier grass, there are other volatile chemicals that are attracting the pest in there. So you have this push, pushing the pest out of the corn system, and then the pull, bringing them into the Napier grass. The Napier grass itself, after they oviposit into it, the way it grows, it actually leads to the destruction of the eggs. It kind of stretches out and kills these moth eggs. And so you effectively are able to reduce pest populations and improve yields in these corn systems. You may think that by planting this Napier grass, growers are, of course, going to be losing out a little bit on acreage of corn, and so the gains you may have in yield here are offset possibly by having to take out some corn. But they found that this grass, you could actually use it as fodder for dairy cattle, and so a lot of farmers that have adopted this, they see improved yields of corn, and then they're actually turning this Napier grass into fodder and getting into the dairy business, and overall their farm income is risen. It's not that I want to talk about how we could do this here in Oregon, but rather just give a concrete example of one of these intercropping systems that has had a large degree of success. But the killer is that this took about 30 years to develop, and a lot of different scientists and a lot of funding working with these growers out in the Horn of Africa to get to this point where we have this nice system that does function rather well. But the point is, this sort of stuff it can be done, it's very context specific, and it takes a lot of time. There's going to be slides that say questions. Because of time, I'm going to just run through these things, and we can do Q&A at the very end of the talk. So coming back to Northern California, the work we were doing with these growers in Napa and Sonoma, the focal pest that they were most interested in developing these practices for is the western grape leafhopper, Erythronura elegantula. You'll have this here in Southern Oregon. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this here in the nymph stage and the adult. This, of course, causes leaf stippling. This leads to reductions in fruit quality and yield. And as many of you know, of course, the biology of this pest is such that when you do have a really bad outbreak, you have these large populations of adults later in season, right around harvest. And when you got crews going in there picking by hand, these things can be a real nuisance, flying in eyes, etc. We've heard of crews in the Central Valley in California walking off of harvest operations when they've had outbreaks of these leafhoppers that are pretty horrendous. Now, the key parasitoids of these leafhoppers are two species of egg parasitoids, wasps that attack the eggs of the leafhopper in the genus Anagris. Anagris erythromurae and Anagris dania. So here's a little picture of the adult female wasp. This is a leafhopper egg with a developing parasitoid inside of it. So much like the movie Aliens, you have the parasitoid laying its egg into the egg of the leafhopper. That egg develops inside there, and then the parasitoid emerges from the leafhopper egg, and obviously that kills the leafhopper. Just a quick video here. Hope this will work to give you an idea of the minute size. So you have your Anagris wasp here. Sorry for the sound. I wish I'd been able to mute that. And the video quality is as best as I can do with a cell phone with the lens cameras. But very small. It's one of the 5 smallest known parasitoids on the planet. The other natural enemies of leafhoppers, you have a whole host of key predators that we find out in the vineyard. Many of these are familiar faces. You see ladybugs, green lacewings, minor pirate bugs, hoverflies, and of course spiders. These guys make up about 90% of the predator community in vineyards. And we'll show data on these guys later on in the talk. But really the key factor for control of the grape leafhoppers are these Anagris parasitoids. These predators, they're generalist predators. They eat leafhoppers, but they also can eat each other. They can eat the Anagris parasitoid. They're not real specialized on grape leafhopper, unlike Anagris, which is directly, must attack those eggs to complete its life cycle. So very briefly, we're reviewing some of the seasonal dynamics of leafhoppers and Anagris parasitoids in vineyards. You have the overwintering leafhoppers that emerge and begin to oviposit on the vines in the late spring. You get a little bump in the adult population, and then as they oviposit more, and then you get this second generation here. This is this really high population of leafhoppers you get later on in the growing season. If the Anagris colonize the vineyard later in the season, they will, start to parasitize these eggs, but it's a little late, and you get this late season outbreak. Here's kind of another model where the Anagris are colonizing the vineyard earlier in the year. They can start parasitizing the leafhoppers earlier in the season. They develop really rapidly. They have multiple generations relative to one generation of leafhoppers, and their populations will take off, and you get really high parasitism rates and subsequently really low leafhopper populations. So the key with Anagris and leafhoppers is to get the Anagris in the vineyard as early as possible in the growing season. We always see them show up, even when you have an outbreak. They are in there at the end of the season, but it's just too little, too late. So the big question with this group in Napa and Sonoma County was, can flowering cover crops attract and support higher populations of these Anagris parasitoids? So 2007 to 2009, we had a number of pilot studies where we were working with growers to identify flowers that would work specifically in North Coast vineyards, and then subsequently develop guidelines for the establishment and management of these flowers, of course evaluating insect response to them, and having a number of field days, site visits, etc., where growers were actually trading information about what was working, what was not working on their farm. We were giving them feedback about the insects we were finding on these things. And ultimately, after a number of years of these pilot studies, trying out things like buckwheat, alyssum, wild carrot, California bluebells, you name it, folks were looking at these guides and said these things would be great for beneficial insects, and they were trying them out in every which way, between the vines, under the vines, around the perimeter of the vineyard, dialing in the machinery to sow these things, etc. And what we ultimately landed on was the use of 3 species of flowering cover crop: Phacelia tanacetifolia, Ambimagus, and Daucus colora. Now we chose these for a number of reasons. One, they have an overlapping bloom sequence. You have the Phacelia blooming in the late spring, Ambi in the early summer, and then the Daucus comes on and blooms for the rest of the growing season. So you have something in bloom in the vineyard throughout the entirety of the grape growing season, or the majority of it at least. The ease of integration with vineyard management was critical. If we could find that some flowering cover crop works to enhance biocontrol, but nobody could realistically use it in a vineyard, what is the point? So this is critical when we were doing these pilot studies with growers. All of these flowers, they can be sown in the fall. This is when folks had out their machinery, their seeders for putting in overwintering cover crops. Drought tolerant, of course in California this is critical, so none of these flowers require any form of supplemental irrigation. They can all develop just fine off of winter rains. And then of course, They do not compete with the crop. And then, of course, they attract beneficial insects and have fairly accessible nectaries that a small little parasitoid like the anagris could actually hit at. So just some images of these flowers here. We sow them in every other vine row. This is the Phacelia in bloom in the late spring. And now just to step through a sequence, we have all three of these flowers sown together in alternate rows. And as one comes up and blooms, as it passes peak bloom, we give it a high mow about 10 to 12 inches off the ground, and that opens up the canopy of this cover crop to allow the next species of flower to come up and bloom. So the Phacelia blooms, you mow it, you open up the canopy, the Ami comes up, blooms, you mow it, canopy's open again, and then the wild carrot comes up. So kind of boom, boom, boom. And then, of course, at the end of the season, of course, we go in, disc these things under, make room for crews to come in, harvest the grapes, whether it's manual or mechanical, and then re-sow the flowers after harvest. So having designed this cover crop treatment that seemed like it was scalable in commercial vineyards, we went ahead to do a 2-year study to evaluate whether or not, and the degree to which this would actually increase biocontrol of leafhoppers. So a 2-year study with paired plots, one with monoculture, one with the flowering cover crops. This took place all in vineyards with red grape varietals, 5-year-old vines, of course no insecticides, 2-acre plots, big flat square blocks, half with flowers, half without. What we found on the ground cover, we have here, this is the bloom for Phacelia, Ami, and the Daucus, and then you have your flower plot and our control plot. So these flowers certainly attracted a lot of beneficial insects. We saw significantly higher abundance of a variety of different predators on these flowers at every point in the season when they were in bloom. Unfortunately, we did not see any sort of effect in the vine canopy itself. There were no significant differences between plots with and without the flowers in terms of the predators we were actually finding in the vine canopy. So these things came in on flowers, but they didn't necessarily move up into the canopy, much less have any impact on pest populations. Now spiders, we did see an increase in their population in the vine canopy itself. And unfortunately, though, as I already said here, we didn't really see any effect of this increase in population of predators on the leafhoppers themselves. And the anagris also, we didn't really see, other than this little bump here early in the season, there were a little bit more in the flower plots. This is up in the vine canopy. But the effect was sort of diluted later in the season. So we didn't see a very strong response of natural enemies in the vine canopy itself. And looking at leafhopper parasitism rates, again, a little bit of a bump in the flower plot, but this wasn't a significant difference. Again, a little higher here, but again, not considered a significant increase in parasitism in leafhoppers. Now, of course, vine vigor, in terms of total petiole nitrogen content at bloom, cane pruning weights, we didn't see any real effect of these cover crops on vigor in any way. Similarly, with yield and wine grape quality, as measured by degrees bricks here, no differences between the plots with and without the flowering. So, in summary, we did see more abundant natural enemy populations on the flowering cover crops, but there was really not much of a difference observed in the vine canopy itself, and no difference in pest population or parasitism rates subsequently. Luckily, the flowers do not influence vigor, yield, or quality. So, kind of a bust. We've done all this work to develop this cover crop practice, and really saw that we bring in beneficials, but that never had a knock-on effect in terms of reducing pest populations. Now, something we did observe across all of our study sites is that there was a lot of variation. Some sites did have a lot of leafhoppers, some did not, regardless of the plots with and without cover crops. And this map here is showing you approximately where these split plot trials took place. And so we started to think that possibly some of the variation we were seeing in pest and natural enemy populations between the sites, regardless of the cover crops, might have to do with landscape context. And this is really important to think about, because I think for many of us managing a farm, we think about on-farm diversification and what can we do in a given plot or within our farm system. But insects respond to habitat diversification at multiple scales. These things are moving across the landscape to varying degrees depending on their size and capacity for movement. And so you have to think about diversification both at the local scale, but also at the landscape scale. So here's a vineyard down in Carneros. It's a region that's just totally dominated by wine grapes, very little natural habitat. But here, this is more closer to St. Helena, northern Napa County. You have these vineyards interspersed with big patches of woodland and riparian habitat. So these are monocultures, but they're actually in fairly diverse landscapes. And grape leafhoppers and anagris may be very sensitive to changes and habitat diversity at the landscape scale due to their overwintering biology. In the summer, you have the grape leafhoppers active in the vineyard, with the anagris parasitoids turning over generations on the leafhopper eggs. But in the fall, the leafhoppers overwinter as adults in reproductive diapods, and they stay in the vineyard. They just reside in the leaf litter or on grasses around the perimeter. I'm sure you've observed this at your own vineyards. The anagris, on the other hand, they actually require a leafhopper egg in order to successfully overwinter. So they have to leave the vineyard and find this alternate leafhopper host, which they can attack in the fall and reside in that egg over the winter. And then in the spring, they'll emerge from the egg, they'll complete their development, and recolonize the vineyard. So they've got to move between the pest leafhopper and then some form of an alternate host, another species of leafhopper, which we typically think are found in these big patches of natural habitat around the farm. So you can immediately see here the distance in which your vineyard resides away from this overwintering habitat is really going to affect the timing and the abundance of these parasitoids moving back onto the farm. So what we did is we went back with our data and we took a measure. This is a land use classification map that I've kind of overlaid with Google Earth here and color-coded, agriculture in yellow, natural habitats in green, and development here in gray. And we kind of took a cookie cut around a half a kilometer around each site and quantified what percentage of that area was comprised of natural habitat. So you get these different measures for each site. How much natural habitat here? Roughly 13% here, 22, 48. These are dummy numbers, but just to get an idea, to assign a measure of landscape diversity to each of these sites. And what we found was that regardless of the cover crop, vineyards that were in more diverse landscapes had higher populations of these anagris parasitoids early in the growing season. And then subsequent to that, we found that early season parasitism of leafhoppers, which if you remember that little model graph I showed in the beginning, this is kind of critical to getting late season control. We found that where you had more anagris parasitoids relative to leafhoppers, you had higher parasitism. This makes sense. What we found then was that early season parasitism rate, the higher it was, the lower your late season leafhopper population is. And then in addition to that, and this is again regardless of the cover crop, we found that the cover crop did not compete with the grapevine vigor in any way. But if you just looked at the vigor of these vineyards in and of themselves, the ones that had higher total petiole nitrogen content actually had higher late season leafhopper populations as well. So we know that leafhoppers respond to vigor, and this is what we're showing here. So in these more diverse landscapes, we saw an increased abundance of anagris in the early season. That increased abundance led to increased parasitism of leafhoppers early in the season, which then reduced late season outbreaks. And then subsequently, we also found late season outbreaks were further reduced in vineyards that had lower vigor, or ultimately enhanced in vineyards with very high vigor. So these findings were kind of counterintuitive to what we first set out to do. We wanted to look at these flowering cover crops, and what we found was that, yes, habitat diversity still plays a very important role in enhancing biocontrol of leafhoppers. It's just that it's landscape diversity rather than local diversity in the form of these cover crops that really drove the dynamics we saw in these systems. So what we did to follow up some of these findings was actually go out and quantify what plants the anagris were actually overwintering on. So when I say, a vineyard has X amount of natural habitat surrounding the vineyard, we assume that that natural habitat does contain overwintering habitat for the anagris parasitoids. But what plants in particular are they overwintering on? So what we did is 12 different sites with large patches of natural habitat, sampled them once a month for over a 2-year period, reared out all of the anagris parasitoids, and then also collected the leafhoppers that were associated with these different plant species. Here's some of our lucky undergraduate students collecting vegetation to rear out in the greenhouse for the parasitoids. Here's Mike with our insect vacuum. This is basically a leaf blower vacuum modified to vacuum leafhoppers off of vegetation. The veg we would cut from these sites, we bring it back to the greenhouse, put it in these emergence chambers. These are opaque cylinders with a little funnel and a vial at the top that lets light in. We simulate spring-summer conditions, taking this vegetation in the winter, bringing it to the greenhouse, and the parasitoids sort of wake up, complete their development thinking it's spring, and they exhibit phototaxis, so they go towards the light. And so they come out of this vegetation, come up into the vial, and then we can collect them and identify them there. What we found, Anagrus erythrinaria and Anagrus dania, the two key parasitoids of the great leafhoppers, they overwinter on a small handful of plants. Anagrus erythrinaria here on Baccharis, this is coyote brush. This is something that's endemic to California. Blackberry, alder trees, coast live oak, and California buckeye. Dania, much more limited to just blackberry. So these are the plants in those natural habitats that they're specifically overwintering on. So not all natural habitats are created alike, right? It's all about this small handful of plants that really drive these parasitoids overwintering biology. Here's another set of plants. I'm calling these cultivated. These are things that we don't commonly find in the landscapes of the North Coast region. This is stuff that you'd find more in gardens, hedgerows. It was stuff that was in and around the vineyard. So this is also, useful if you're planning to put in a hedgerow or some sort of landscape planting to think about including these species. So here is catnip, this is mint, sage, ceanothus, a little bit of apple here, a little bit of manzanita down here at the bottom. But really, these mints and sages are really important for Anagrus erythrinaria. Danii, again, much more cryptic, much more limited to just one plant, roses. So you can see here, going back, Danii, just on blackberry, just on roses, erythrinaria, a little bit more variability in what you can utilize. We sampled these plants not just in the winter, but over the entire growing season. And we found that certain plants consistently yielded parasitoids throughout the year. So while I did have this kind of simplified version of the parasitoids going to the natural habitat and then returning to the vineyard in the spring and summer, some portion of their population does continue to reside on these alternate plants throughout the year. Another group of plants, we saw that their utilization was much more seasonal. California buckeye in particular, it leaves out in the spring, but it's drought deciduous, and those leaves drop pretty quickly in May and June as soil moisture gets reduced. So we really only found the parasitoids on this plant in the spring period. Alder, again, when it had leaves, we found the parasitoids, but in the winter, it wasn't actually overwintering on it, it was just using it as a host during the growing season. And then another handful of plants here, a little bit unclear. We saw not consistent, but not quite seasonal use. I think this is kind of an artifact of our sampling. Some of these things weren't consistently sampled throughout the entirety of the year. But the point is to think about this continuous versus seasonal use of habitat. Now, I do have data on all of these leafhoppers that were associated with these different overwintering plants. I'm not really going to get into it. There's a long list, and I can send you the publication if you'd like to look into it. We have them associated with the plants that the Anagrus are coming out of, but we never did any further study to actually determine that yes, Anagrus is attacking this species of leafhopper on this plant. We just knew that these 5 species are on coyote brush, and we found a lot of Anagrus on coyote brush, so maybe these species of alternate leafhoppers were the ones it was utilizing. And I just threw up a couple pictures of them here. But the point to really consider here is that these host plants, it's not that Anagrus love coyote brush. They love to go to the leafhoppers that are on that coyote brush. So in some cases, you can have habitat around a vineyard that may have previously produced a lot of Anagrus in our surveys, but without the leafhopper host on there, it's not going to work for what you want to do. So just summarizing this very quickly here, coyote brush and blackberry really appear to be the primary Anagrus overwintering habitat, at least in the North Coast. They are utilizing some of these plants throughout the year, which does have implications for vineyard recolonization. So if there's a mistimed spray or some other event that knocks out your parasitoid population midway through the season, having coyote brush and blackberry around the vineyard may allow the parasitoids to move back in the middle of the season, rather than just in the spring. So finally, I'll end on one other study here, looking at vineyards in proximity to large patches of natural habitat, and riparian habitat in particular. It's a 2-year study, 3 to 5 sites per year. Again, just like the cover crop study, they're red varietals, 5-year-old vines. In this case, there were some insecticide sprays for the European grapevine moth, Lobesia petrana. This was a moth pest that there were mandatory sprays for. We worked with the growers to put on products that had the lowest toxicity possible to natural enemies and the leafhoppers. So, for full disclosure, letting you all know this, we don't think it really affected the outcome of this study. And just to give you an idea of how this was set up, here's the Russian River in Sonoma County. This is not literally where our sites were, but a number of vineyards directly adjacent to these habitats. Looking at predators here, what we found is there was no significant difference in predator abundance early in the season between samples we took within the riparian habitat or in the vineyard. There's a little bump here at the edge, but nothing significant. You have a lot of lacewings, a lot of soldier beetles here. Later on in the season, overall predator population drops, primarily dominated by Aureus. We see again here higher populations of spiders at the edge, but not significantly different. And the anagris wasp, we thought we may see at the riparian interior and edge, if they were overwintering in here, we thought we might see really high populations of them in the early season as they move into the vineyard, but that really wasn't the case. Kind of unequivocal or equivocal populations between the different sampling points. There are some significant differences, but we didn't find these to really be meaningful. And then, of course, in the later season, you see a really high population of anagris in the vineyard itself. This is, of course, because they're reproducing and very rapidly on the leafhoppers in the vineyard. Leafhopper nymphs, what we did see, found this very interesting, that at the vineyard interior, there were significantly higher populations of leafhoppers relative to the vineyard edge, especially here in the early season. Parasitism rates were equivalent between the edge and the interior. And this was a little bit surprising. We thought we might see, because of the higher population in the interior, that there would be higher parasitism at the vineyard edge, but it is a little bit elevated, but not significantly different. So there was really, to us, no clear natural enemy response relative to the riparian habitat. There were lower leafhopper populations at the vineyard edge. Parasitism did not seem to account for that reduction in leafhopper populations closer to the riparian habitat. But in doing our assessments of parasitism, we did notice that leafhopper egg deposition was also very low at the vineyard edge relative to the interior. So these higher populations of leafhoppers seem to be primarily due to the fact that they were just laying more eggs at the vineyard interior. And we started to wonder, we knew about this vigor effect from some of our cover crop studies. If you reduce the vigor of the vines, the leafhoppers aren't going to go for them as much. And we started to wonder, maybe the same was true for vineyards or other crops adjacent to these large patches of natural habitat. So this study originally took place in 2011, 2012, or 2010, 2011. We processed this data, we realized this difference in egg deposition, and so in 2013 we went back to a subset of our study sites, looked at pest densities, egg deposition and parasitism rates, and crop vigor. So in the follow-up work, we again saw increased egg deposition at the vineyard interior. We saw higher nymph populations at the vineyard interior. We saw, again, this bump in parasitism at the edge, but it wasn't significantly different. And then, I'm not showing the data here, but if you think about how we evaluate parasitism, this is a percentage of eggs parasitized. And because we have lower or fewer eggs at the vineyard edge, it only took a few eggs being parasitized to really get a higher parasitism rate. So when we looked at actual numbers of eggs parasitized rather than a proportion, they were basically the same between these two. Petiole nitrogen content, this is new to this follow-up work. We did see that it was elevated at the vineyard interior. And when we looked at nitrogen content and tried to directly relate it to leafhopper, number of leafhopper eggs per leaf, so looking at egg deposition relative to vigor, this is across all three of these study sites. There was actually a flat relationship. So we were a little bit frustrated to see that because we thought, okay, higher vigor, you're going to have higher egg deposition, but when we pooled the data, that effect wasn't coming out. But then when you split it by site, there was a very strong correlation. So at each of these sites where you had higher vigor, you had higher leafhopper egg deposition. And so what this is telling us is that if you look at it here, it's not that there's a specific threshold of vigor that the leafhoppers are looking for in order to increase their egg deposition, but rather they're making the best of what they've got at a given site. So wherever they've got higher vigor in a specific vineyard, they're laying more eggs. So vineyard proximity to riparian habitat does appear to influence leafhopper egg deposition and subsequent nymph abundance. but the effect appears to be mediated by changes in vine vigor rather than an increase in natural enemy populations closer to the riparian habitat, which is what we originally had hypothesized. So wrapping up this work here, this is kind of your worst case scenario. Really vigorous vines and a very low diversity landscape. This is a grapevine in Mendocino County just totally destroyed by Virginia creeper leafhopper. This is part of a different project we're working on, increased parasitism there, and I'm not going to be talking about it, but it's some of the worst leafhopper outbreaks I've ever seen. So summarizing across these vineyard diversification studies that we've conducted, the flowering cover crops, they attract a lot of beneficials, but this doesn't really seem to have any effect on biocontrol itself. They essentially show up on the flowers, get a free meal, and hit the road. Landscape diversity, rather, is key to leafhopper and anagris dynamics, and especially the presence of overwintering habitat in close proximity to the vineyard. Crop vigor, of course, can affect leafhopper densities. We just talked about that. And the point I want to make is to really try not to confuse the vigor effect with the habitat effect. And this has been the mistake of some of our previous studies looking at cover crops. So I just kind of added a little imaginary buffer here around this riparian area of low vigor in the vineyard. And you can see a similar thing in some plots with cover crops, whether or not the competition from the flowering cover crop is leading to lower pest populations rather than any sort of natural enemy augmentation effect. So wrapping up here, when we think about diversification, as I've mentioned, the scale of that diversification is really important to consider. And landscape diversity kind of underwrites any other sort of effect you're going to get from on-farm diversification. And this is because these large patches of natural habitat in any given cropping region supports what we call metapopulations of natural enemies. So this is sort of your background population of natural enemies that are out there that may or may not be colonizing these agroecosystems. So your ability to augment them by introducing some sort of localized on-farm diversification is really going to be contingent on whether or not you have a metapopulation, or how healthy or how abundant that metapopulation is in a given cropping region. So throwing this habitat out there, and the beneficials moving on to it. So if you don't have that habitat, where are these beneficials going to come from? And so we also think there's the risk of conducting studies with these cover crops in a really low diversity region. You may not see any effect. And it may not be because the cover crops aren't able to bring in the natural enemies, but it's just by the fact that you're in such a simplified, agricultural region that there's nothing to even attract. I think this is more of an issue for the Central Valley or somewhere like that. In California, it's very diverse up here, especially in Southern Oregon. But the point is that your diversification strategy will really differ depending on the type of landscape you're in. And these aren't hard numbers. This is just kind of a demonstrative scale here, but here's low, intermediate, high diversity landscapes, and your diversification practices may really be contingent on the type of landscape you're in. If you're down here in a really low diversity landscape, it may be that landscape scale restoration of habitat is more important than any sort of on-farm diversification, which may work better in a more intermediate landscape. And then, of course, your diversification strategy is really going to be contingent on the species that you're trying to manipulate. So this whole thing about landscape diversity and cover crops that I've been showing you is just for grape leafhopper and anagris. Well, what about mites? What about vine mealybug and gyrus parasitoids? It's frustrating because it's really hard to say, oh, this landscape diversity stuff is great for everything. No, it's great for these. We don't really know how great it would be for these other pests. So this is going back to what I was showing you at the very beginning of this talk about how these habitat diversification programs to enhance biocontrol, pollinators, you name it, they're very context specific. Both the geography of the region, the organisms that you're trying to manipulate within that region. And so finally, the proposal that we've been putting forward for a number of years here is that in order to get this stuff really dialed in, to make it work for growers in a commercial setting, we've really got to start thinking about how to stack multiple ecosystem services. All this work I've talked about, grape leafhopper and anagris, it's fine, but I know that you are managing multiple pests and managing for multiple goals on farm. And it's just because of our reductionist approach to a lot of the science so far that we come up with these highly detailed programs for one pest or one parasitoid at a time. And something you work out for mealybugs and their parasitoids may actually contradict what's going on or what we need for anagris and leafhoppers. A lot of the growers in Napa and Sonoma, because of Pearson's disease and glassy winged sharpshooter, blue-green sharpshooter, they have ripped out all of their blackberry to control those insects which are vectors of Pearson's disease. When I showed this data and said, hey, we got to plant blackberry all over the vineyard, they're sitting there saying, oh, I just ripped it all out. I don't want to put it back in. But this is a nice graphic I like from a paper that was originally proposing this idea of stacking services. And what I do here, biological control of insect pests, is really just consider one of multiple services that can benefit growers. And I think this is really going to require us in the future to design more multidisciplinary collaborative studies that look at multiple factors that are being influenced by a hedgerow, by cover crops, by landscape diversity, you name it. Even cultural values and aesthetics, things that do matter in viticulture, again, with these tourists coming out to your farm. So this is really just my proposal for how we should proceed, in a given region to develop something like this. It would really be worth our while to bring in a number of different specialists to look at soil quality, look at pollinators, look at biocontrol. So with that, I'll conclude and take some questions. But first, would like to acknowledge the funding for a lot of this research came from the Robert Van den Bosch Scholarship, and of course, with collaboration from a number of farm advisors, Dr. Monica Cooper in Napa County in particular, Dr. Sergey Jepsen down at UC Riverside. He's ostensibly the world authority on these anagris parasitoids. He helped us with a lot of the identification work. And then, of course, numerous grape growers throughout the North Coast who helped us over the years collaborating on this work. And very quickly, before we open it up for questions, I do have a second part here, a little update on red blotch, which is what Daniel had initially contacted me about. So that's another major issue for us, and I know for you all as well. And I will get into a brief update review of kind of what we know to date on that, pending that we have enough time.
Yeah, we're good on time. I have a question for you about anagris and not just pesticides, but I've read that sulfur can impact them quite a bit. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, Jay Rosenheim at UC Davis did a number of studies on this a few years ago. And what they found was that when you have an anagris parasitoid, you remember how small they were. They are very difficult to manage in the lab. A small drop of condensation, surface tension of that, they'll go up to drink from it, pulls their head in and drown, it's gone. I don't know how they persist in the environment as well as they do. But what Dr. Rosenheim found was when you put one of these things in a petri dish and you spray it with some sulfur, yeah, it knocks it out. It is incredibly, have very negative impacts on it. But when they followed this up with field studies to evaluate the impacts of sulfur sprays under field conditions on anagris, they actually found that there weren't any significant negative effects.
That's great.
Which was kind of surprising to see. And it may be that their populations were just so high that you knock them back, and many more are coming out of these leafhoppers or migrating in. I think there was a difference between wettable sulfur and ultimate is escaping the dust, I guess. I think the wettable was a little less, or the wettable had more of an impact on them, but overall there was no impacts.
You don't have to worry about wiping out our entire population just because we're going in early with sulfur.
I don't think so, and I mean it would be very difficult to time it once they're in the vineyard. I think what happens is once you get these populations in the vineyard and they're constantly migrating in, they're attacking these leafhopper eggs. And I think if you have a spray go on and you kill some of the adults that are wandering around on a leaf looking for eggs to parasitize, they may get wiped out, but the ones that have already begun to develop in a leafhopper egg, it's kind of like they're in a little sleeping bag or something. That egg may itself protect them from the sulfur, and those come out and kind of repopulate the vineyard very rapidly. So they can complete 3 generations in the time that it takes for a leafhopper egg from being laid to developing. And so you have this first generation of leafhoppers put their eggs out there, and the anagris that come in and kind of grow their populations exponentially. So they're quite resilient.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
When you say blackberry, are you referring to the Himalaya berry?
Yeah, we did not differentiate between the different invasive and native species of blackberry. I think either would work. There's a lot of Himalayan blackberry that we sampled in this because that's kind of what's all over the place there. I'm sure you see it here. But I never parsed the endemic to the invasive. But I believe the leafhopper host, we actually know quite a bit about this blackberry leafhopper and system. It was kind of the basis for some of this work that took place back in the 60s and 70s. Dicrella californica. I think it's on both of the invasive and native. Yeah.
Questions about the flowering cover crop study. Well, maybe a comment, but I wonder whether, I realize that a lot of the overwintering species you identified are shrubs and stuff that you wouldn't use as cover crop anyway. But I wonder maybe the influence of tilling under every fall your cover crop versus a lot of people around here use permanent cover crops. So whether that might have had, by providing some overwintering in your vineyard as opposed to plowing under might have some effect, or maybe you don't think so, but any
No, I mean, that's always been a suggestion from a lot of the growers we work with when we say, the leafhoppers are down there in the leaf litter, till that stuff under and that can kill off a bunch of the overwintering leafhopper populations. If I'm understanding your question correctly.
Well, or maybe the overwintering, so you're building up a lot of your anagris populations in those cover crops, but they're not necessarily moving out to the vineyard, but maybe having a permanent cover crop that also goes to the winter could help those anagris to stay in the vineyard over the winter.
If it's the right species,
Right.
If you've got coyote brush and blackberry around the edge of the vineyard, I think a lot of those perennial shrubs, there's no way you're going to put them between the vine rows, right? And
So are there any annuals that maybe could be in that category, or is almost all of these sort of perennial shrubs?
no, this is something that Tom Lowry up in British Columbia has been looking into. I think he may even have a study going on right now. You remember the cultivated species that I showed you?
Yeah.
So catnip, mint, in particular, those throw off a lot of leafhoppers per unit of plant material. Like per gram, we're getting 200 or something like that. Just incredible. So the leafhopper is very abundant on there that it's attacking. It would be very interesting to do a study where you plant mint or catnip or some combination as a permanent cover crop in the vineyard. I mean,
Those two are pretty aggressive. I'm not sure.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, I'm surprised y'all haven't asked me about the wild carrot that we planted and all that. Because that stuff, we found it growing along the side of the road. That it was so great for late season because it's so drop tolerant and growing out of the asphalt. And yeah, there was a little resistance from the growers to do this, but it was all in conversation. I said, for this, we'd be willing to check it out. And absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, the other question that I have is just, I think, did you say it was 2 years that you did it, this experiment? Do you think that maybe it could be that it might take more than 2 years to sort of have some of these effects of, population
Absolutely. It's a
building?
major problem with our funding models and some of our experimental strategies that come out of that. A lot of studies, 2 years is what we go for. But I would love to do a 3 or 5 or 10-year study to really look at these dynamics over time, especially relative to the overwintering habitat. Because let's step back to what you were saying about putting these perennials in the vineyard itself and the difficulty of doing that. Well, it seems to me that it would be maybe easier to integrate this with commercial production if we had every 10th row taken that out and filled it with one of these overwintering plants, right? You're taking some crop out of production, but you're not interfering. You still have these nice monocultures, you get equipment, people, and all that. There's a lot of questions about the movement of anagris, how quickly or how far they can move. Is it every 10th row? Is it every 20th row? How frequently will we need to diversify with this overwintering perennial stuff to really get a consistent effect? But then on top of that, and this is a study we've never conducted, we've always kind of posited this, think about the size of the vineyard relative to the size of the overwintering refuge. There was previous work similar to what I'm showing you here today where folks found that, like I said, blackberry and then also French prune trees were good overwintering habitat for the anagris. And you'll see today up in Napa Sonoma, in other places, these vineyards that have French prune along the perimeter or along the driveway. 2 rows next to 100 acres of vineyard or something like that. And so think about this over time. You have your anagris overwintering on those French prune trees. They move into the vineyard that following season, exponentially grow their population on the leafhoppers on the grapevines, and then that winter they move back in mass to these French prune trees. There's so many of them coming out of the vineyard that they could possibly just wipe out, parasitize all of the alternate leafhopper hosts on the French prune trees. It's fine. Next Next year, they're going to come back out and go into the vineyard and do their thing again. But at this third winter, when they go back to those French prune trees, you don't have the host anymore. So there's all these questions in addition to their movement and speed and the distance they can travel. The other big question to us is how much of this overwintering habitat do you need relative to your acreage of vineyard?
Yeah.
And that's an outstanding question. That's a great follow-up study for something.
I know we're out of time, but just one comment is just the difference between having farmed in California and here. You know, we have a lot of growth during into the spring and even into the fall compared to California.
Mm-hmm.
So just because we have a little bit later spring rains and oftentimes earlier fall rains, and so I think this area might be pretty different in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not trying by any means to say,
Yeah.
we did this in Napa, you guys should do it here in the Road Valley. That was the beginning of this talk, right? Is that this is very specific information to a pest and a region, etc. Paul.
I really loved it. I think the lessons about movement and landscape and the case-specific nature is great. Really enjoyed that. I did work years ago on dispersal rates, reservoirs, and the rates at which populations recovered after use pesticides. And basically, it's an incredibly complementary message. So if you've got a parasitoid that's really not moving very far, a single spray kind of eliminates this insect from your fields for like years.
Yeah.
So where you place these stepping stone habitats and monitoring things through time is very, very important. And I really appreciate what you're saying. But it does make me realise that almost like the data that's most lacking is how far these things actually do move.
Right, and there's been a couple preliminary studies where folks were actually marking and recapturing,
Right.
and they found that they had a pretty rapid dispersal rate.
Yeah.
But it was difficult because these things are so small, right?
Yeah.
You think about an insect, the larger it is, roughly the further it can fly. Think about a honeybee versus a mosquito or something like that. But then you go way down on the spectrum to really minute insects like anagras. And then suddenly that correlation falls apart. They're so small, they're actually thought to disperse more like aerial plankton.
Yeah.
And they can actually go kilometers at a time, way far. And the studies that were done did give them a fairly far dispersion, something like half a kilometer or a kilometer per day. But there were all these questions about wind direction in the vineyard, how the air moves over these raised canopies, and it's something we really don't know. We think they can disperse quite far, well, I'll leave it at that. We need to know more about how they move, but they're very difficult to mark and capture, although it has been done in a couple cases.
It'd be fun to try it here with the different dynamics and look at just the arrival rate of things into the yacht, isn't it?
Yeah, oh,
What's
absolutely.
arriving each day? If that's driven by the weather, it tells you that the wind is bringing them on, all those Californian insects blown by the window here.
Yeah.
Instead of all the pests that you guys take aside.
I have all sorts of anecdotal stuff from working with this wasp in the lab about how I think they move and how they can kind of go like aerial plankton and then drop out of the sky like a stone, and what causes them to do that. But all of it would be very necessary follow-up.
Well, look at our spider spatial dynamics papers in Journal of Pharmacology from a few years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, great.
Just a couple of points and questions. And we do see this dynamic here where we just have leafhoppers in some vineyards, they blow up other vineyards, clean, parasitization rates are just really variable from vineyard to vineyard. And we have blackberry everywhere, and that's sort of ubiquitous as a host. I mean, just a couple, but you have cases where you have blackberry but don't have the correct leafhopper host for the anagras to make it.
Very likely. I mean, the data I showed was just based on the amount of natural habitat around the vineyard. I never was able to take it much further and say, okay, this percentage is blackberry, this is coyote brush, etc.
Right.
But I do think that may be the case. That example where I said the anagras coming from the vineyard wipe out overwintering the hosts after a number of years. You may have blackberry all throughout the region, but it may be that they're kind of blinking on and off like Christmas lights. In one year they're overwintering here, another year they're overwintering there. How is the weather that year affecting their migration into the vineyard?
And talking about the weather, have you seen with these hot years we've had the last couple of years, you seen like a third generation of Western Gray leafhopper?
Oh, yeah, so we get a partial third. In Mendocino County, I've seen that more, just a little bit, maybe 10 degrees warmer up there. But it's, I say 2, but you sometimes get this partial third and a high.
I mean, is there any chance the phenology could get out of sync where you, perhaps a parasitoid would be sort of missing? I mean, that could be some of the issue why we don't see, maybe the level of parasitization that we've seen in the past, these last couple of years.
Yeah. I would think that it has more to do with a limited overwintering population and proximity to that vineyard, but another outstanding question is whether or not, or what triggers them to move into the vineyard. If you've got this proportion that stay on the pack all year, what's up with that group that decides to go into the vineyard? Is it just happenstance, or is there some trigger that they get? They pick up on chemical cues from the grapevines as the leafhoppers being oviposits, and then say, okay, it's time to go. There's a lot of stuff that's very unclear about their movement.
And I guess my last question was the edge effect that you saw. Was there a good correlation between size of vineyard, likelihood? I mean, is the bigger the vineyard you have, the more chance you're going to have a leafhopper population that becomes a problem?
No, I've seen it all across the board. Little pocket vineyards that just get crazy outbreaks every year, and I think that has more to do with their, mismanagement of the leafhoppers. This is kind of a stupid correlation, but in another study we found that places that have really high leafhopper populations at the beginning of the year, it's most tightly correlated with having a really high population at the end of the year. It's pretty obvious, but there's things you can do to clean up the vineyard to try to knock out these hoppers before you have another outbreak next year. But no, it's a little bit difficult to parse, I think, too, because some of these larger vineyards are more conventional and they're putting on imidacloprid and there's no problem. So. Yeah.
I know you said that the cover crop studies were plots that were insecticide free, but did you learn anything from the flowering cover crop studies that growers that might need to use insecticides should consider?
Would you mind repeating Abby's question so we can clear?
Yeah, so she was saying all of our plots are insecticide free in this cover crop study, but did we learn anything from this or from previous studies about growers who are using these cover crops but then have to put on a product and how that may interfere with the dynamic? Unfortunately, no. All I could do is speculate, because one of the bases for all these studies in entomology is that you just have to have a vineyard that's insecticide free. And so I know folks who do it, some folks who do this cover cropping stuff still put on products, but
Like when you did the high mow, did you guys measure the insects in the cover crop after that?
no, we were just measuring them at peak bloom. There's another study that Miguel Thierry and Claudia Nichols did. It was very similar with flowering cover crops, and they did measure before and after a mow, and they found that by mowing that did force some part of the predator population on those cover crops up into the crop canopy.
Oh, okay.
So that was one strategy, and again, it'd be something to look into, but that just wasn't the design of our study.
Would a trap crop along the edge of a vineyard be effective to keep like alfalfa leafhoppers moving out of dry grass into green cover crops?
Yeah, I think if you manage it.
So segue into.
Yeah, cut me off whenever. I mean, I'll just.
Talk about red blotch. Tell us what you know about red blotch.
Yeah.
You said you had some information.
It's like the mafia is taking me in the background. But that's what everybody wants to know about. And being a good scientist, I'm going to be very disappointing to say I don't know a lot still. But I'll tell you what we do and what we don't know. So as a postdoc working with Kent Dana, I came onto this red blotch project after a number of other folks had made their contribution. We've been working on this as a lab since roughly 2012, 2013. So here's me, but there's dozens of other students, faculty, postdoc, extension people that have contributed to the information that I'm going to present here today. So roughly 2011, 2013, I think you folks have kind of gone through the same experience. We were seeing, even prior to this, we were seeing this leaf roll type symptoms that were not testing positive for leaf roll. What is this other red leaf virus in the vineyard. 2011, 2013, red blotch is identified and characterized by a couple of papers here. It's the Washington State group. Here's the UC Davis group. And yeah, red blotch lowers vigor, lower clusters per vine, reduces pruning weight, and basically have a big impact on fruit ripening. So we have this raised awareness and concern about it, and suddenly everybody's seeing it around Napa, and Sonoma, Central Valley, et cetera, et cetera. Red leaf viruses, there's more than 700 of these. About 70% of them have some sort of an insect mite or nematode, insect mite, nematode, or fungal vector. And red blotch, through its characterization, was thought to be placed in the Gemini viridae, so it's the family that this virus comes from. And vectors of some Gemini viruses include whiteflies, tree hoppers, and leafhoppers. The distribution of red blotch infected vines, we have here all these states with red stars. This is British Columbia, so East Coast, West Coast, Texas. The fact that it's so widespread leads us to think that there isn't necessarily a single vector species. We don't find the same insect in all of these regions, maybe with the exception of something like aphids that could move this virus around. So this kind of initially got us thinking that it was maybe if there's a vector, it was us moving nursery material around, something like that. And that's kind of one of our lines of thinking. I'm not going to go too much further into that, but that was kind of what I thought when I first saw this. And I'm throwing up Dr. Mark Fuchs here because this is some of his information that I'm relaying to y'all from a seminar I've seen. How many of y'all did see the webinar on red blotch that took place a number of weeks ago? Okay, so some of y'all, it's a great thing. You got to go check it out. It's still online on YouTube, and I can send you the link if you're interested. But great overview. All the different labs are there, presenting on what they've been doing, and a lot of this information is basically a summary of that, plus our own work in the Dana lab. So what we're specifically doing is looking at field epidemiology of the virus and then screening candidate vectors, which I've split into two groups, the usual suspects and the novel species. So first, starting with the field epidemiology, this is a large-scale mapping effort that was initiated in 2009 as part of a leaf roll mealybug project. And what you've got here, this is a grid of vines where you see red squares. That's things that were showing visual symptoms for red blotch. And so here you go. This is in 2013, 2014, 2015. So a little bit of clustering here, which is a little bit kind of raised concern for us. But overall, you don't see a really consistent spread pattern besides this little pumpkin. This is data that I walked into. This was not collected by myself. This is, as I mentioned, a previous project for leaf roll, but as red blotch became a problem, they added into their leaf roll assessments red blotch. What we know now is that there's variable display of symptoms in red blotch positive vines. So these are all visual assessments. Do they have red blotch symptoms? Am I not seeing any sort of pattern? Well, it's because they may or may not be showing the symptoms. What we really need to do is test every single vine on here. That's really the only way to know if you've got red blotch. 120 rows by 120 vines. It's a lot of PCR. It's a lot of money. So what we started this year is what I'm calling a mini mapping project. A grid of 6 rows by 20 vines, testing every single vine in that row at multiple sites, and retesting them every year. I don't have anything to show you on this. We just started in the fall, but this is the type of study we want to do, what we are doing to evaluate the spread. Another project we've been working on is to actually evaluate red blotch titer levels within the grapevine itself. So do we see more of the disease in the trunk, in the canes, in the shoots, in the leaves, basal leaves, apical leaves, the roots, you name it. So we're going out and sampling different parts of the grapevine over the growing season in order to see if we can find concentrations of the virus in specific parts of the plant. This would help us for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, to hone in better on insect vectors. If it's all in the roots, all right, let's look at root feeders. If it's all in the shoots, let's look at foliar feeders. If you understand what I'm trying to say here. Plant and insect survey. So we're going right now once a month to multiple vineyards where growers have reported spread of red blotch, collecting, as Kent said, collect every insect in the vineyard and identifying this, which is monumental task, collecting all the insects on vines and ground covers on the natural habitats around the vineyard, as well as sampling plant material on the ground covers, natural habitats, etc. So do we see insects that are tested positive for red blotch? Do we have certain plants outside of the vineyard that have red blotch? Could be serving as a reservoir for the disease. All the plants we've tested here so far have come back negative with the exception of Vitis californica and various hybrids of Vitis californica and vinifera. So wild grape does pretty consistently test positive for red blotch, especially in sites that have lots of red blotch. We don't know if it's coming from there into the vineyard or from the vineyard out to the wild grape, but this is what we can show you to date. Unfortunately, all the insect testing is still in process. We're being very careful about calibrating all of our tests of these insects. It's not a molecular person. It's collaboration with another lab, but as far as I understand, testing grape petioles, we've got that really dialed in. Testing of plant material, a little more difficult, but we can do it. Testing insects, we're being very cautious. We don't want to have any false positives or negatives. But we have tested some insects. Some preliminary tests were done in 2014. We went to vineyards that had vines that had very high, very heavy infections of red blotch, tested the grape leafhoppers that were on those vines. 14 of the 15 vines tested positive. 7 of the 14 groups of leafhoppers, so we're clumping them together to get enough material to test, also tested positive. But I have to drive this home. Just because the insect has the virus in it does not mean it's effective. Kent has some nice little animation that I'm not able to make work here, but these things take in the virus. It can do a whole number of things. It can stay in them, there can be a latency period, they can pass it on through in their excrement. So the fact that we found that these grape leafhoppers had the virus, that was a concern for us, but I cannot tell you enough, it does not mean it's effective. Okay, so it picks up the virus, we don't know if it can actually spread it. And so here, this is our work where we've been screening insect vectors. The usual suspects, all the different leafhoppers that we find in the vineyard, blue-green sharpshooter, a whole range of mealybug and scale insects, phylloxera, aphids, whitefly, mites. These are all the insects that we consider usual suspects. We like to run tests on them, and we're in the process of doing so. And I'll show you some results here in a minute. Novel species, this is the result of some of our insect survey work that I mentioned earlier. It's still ongoing, but Acer, Tigelia, Deltocephalus, all these other ones here. Throw up a few pictures of them. And if you saw the webinar, you may have seen that here, the recorned alfalfa leafhopper, they have identified that as a potential vector. So these are the results to date of our own transmission studies. Western grape leafhopper, 0 plants infected. Variegated Virginia, blue-green sharpshooter, all these bugs here. We've done these trials not just once, but in a variety of ways, using 10 insects per plant. Well, let me step back. So when we do these transmission trials, basic idea, you get infected material, you put the insects on it for a number of days, you take them off, you put them on a clean vine, leave them there for a number of days, and then you take them off and you just hold that clean vine, wait and see if it starts showing symptoms of red blotch. So we hold these things for a 2-year period, test them every 4 months. With some of these things, like grape phylloxera, just completed that one in the fall. We've only tested it twice. Some of these things, like variegated leafhopper, that were very easy for us to pull off in the beginning of this problem. We've not only done multiple trials, but we've held some of these vines for over 2 years at this point and not seen any transmission. And when we do these trials, I say we put some insects on infected material. We've done it every which way. 1 insect per infected vine, 20, 50, 100, 1,000. We thought our potted vines that were red blotch positive from the greenhouse may have low titer levels, and that may be why we weren't seeing transmission. So we have switched recently to using these bouquets of grapevine leaves from vines that we collect out in the field that have really strong infections, really showing symptoms of red blotch. Take those leaves, make a little bouquet. That'll be our infected material for the insects to feed on before we move it over to the clean vine. So I'm not saying here that there is no vector. This is all work that's in progress, but the results from our studies to date show no vector, at least from what we call the usual suspects. So kind of some conclusions here. The large-scale mapping that we have done to date does not indicate any spread. Other research groups claim to see spread. this is sort of the nature of where we're at with red blotch, where there's a lot of different labs doing work, there's some contradictory evidence. In other cases, there's things that we're all kind of finding to be the same. So we're still trying to sort it all out here. The mini mapping project, that's going to further investigate spread from our lab, and the virus titers work, that too is still in process, both in terms of collecting field material and also accurately testing it in the lab. Plant insect sampling work, wild grape is the only plant we have tested that is positive for red blotch outside of the vineyard. Mark Fuchs has found something very similar. I believe when he, last time I saw him talk, he was saying that as they sampled wild grape in areas that were further and further away from viticultural areas, they were finding lower proportions of those wild grapes infected with red blotch, so there's some link there. And then, as I mentioned, our insect samples are still in progress. So just reviewing what I just told you, we've tested a number of common vectors. So far now they've shown transmission. Our plans for this year, of course, the mini mapping, and then a new study where we're actually going to take groups of potted, clean grapevine material, bring it out to the vineyards with red blotch, leave it there for a month at a time, and then bring it back, and do that every month over the growing season. I think Bob Martin up here in Oregon is doing something similar. And again, this is good that we have redundant studies because sometimes we are finding contradictory results. So the idea is by doing this, we expose these for the month of April, like we said, in May, June, July, and then as we hold these in the greenhouse, if we were to see them showing symptoms and testing positive for red blotch, we would obviously know then, okay, there's some vector moving it around, but then we would also have a better idea of what time of year that vector is active. If the potted vines all become positive, regardless of April, June, August, whenever you put them out, okay, it's some insect moving around out there all season. If it's really tightly limited to a small window of time, we just see the vines turning positive from the May group, then let's look at what insects we find in May out in these vineyards. And then, of course, we're ongoing with these transmission experiments, trying now to focus more on novel species. So we're in the process of starting a lot of colonies of these different insects we find out in the vineyard, and then introducing those into these trials. And so I'll end here on some of the results you've probably seen in these other research groups. This is one of the most early papers showing that Virginia creeper leafhopper can transmit red blotch. This is from the Washington State group. We have not been able to get it to transmit the virus in our experiments at Berkeley. The Davis group, I know, has also been working with Virginia creeper and just like us, has not been able to get a similar result. I'm not sure what's up with that, but this is where we're at. So one group has found it, two others have not. The Davis group, Frank Zalem and Brian Botter in particular, this is on the webinar when they announced this finding. They found that three-cornered alfalfa hopper could transmit red blotch. This is a trial they did in the fall, winter, so I think they tested a vine after 5 months and it was coming in positive. And so this caused a lot of emails to come our way. We don't have really clear recommendations for how to manage this in the vineyard yet, or even monitor it. But you do find it causing leaf girdling on grapevines. You'll sometimes see a little dead leaf and look real close, and it's that three-cornered alfalfa hopper there has done that. The next step, after finding something like this that can transmit, our next step is to figure out what its efficiency is. How long does it take to pick up the virus? How well does it transmit to vines? And our thoughts at this point is that even though we have found this as a vector, I kind of feel that there are multiple vectors in the vineyard, maybe a whole cohort of kind of inefficient insect vectors moving this stuff around, but that's just speculation on my part. So I think the key is for everybody to remain calm and do not start spraying the three-cornered alfalfa hopper like crazy. I know Mark Fuchs, when he was showing some of his preliminary findings of just insects that were tested positive, not transmission experiments, so similar to what I showed with the Western Great Leafhopper, he didn't even want to tell the growers what insect genes it was. He just said, we found some that are positive, but I'm not going to tell you, and because he was so worried about everybody going out and kind of nuking the vineyard for this or some other insects. So with that, I can take some more questions here, but would like to acknowledge our funders for this work: American Vineyard Foundation, Foundation Plant Services, collaboration with USDA ARS, Napa Valley Grape Growers Association, Monica Cooper again, there in Napa, numerous grape growers throughout Northern California, and then of course, I forgot to mention this with my previous work, all of these students. There are dozens of people doing lab work, doing field work for us. I get to come up here and talk about this stuff as if I've pulled it all off by myself, but I'm kind of just a cog in the machine. There's a whole army of undergraduate students who work tirelessly for us to provide you all this information, so I've got to acknowledge them. So with that, I'll say thanks again for having me here, Rick and Daniel for inviting me up. It's really an exciting chance to come check out a different region of the Pacific Northwest, and yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. Yeah.
What about, do you have any tests on mechanical transmission? You know, we've got different leaf stripping things that people will use, or hedgers, things like that.
Mark Fuchs did some of that work early on and has not shown any mechanical transmission, so I don't think you need to worry about that.
I have leaf hoppers and I don't spray for them. How am I getting away with that?
You get a really high price per yield, or? I mean, what's your harvest been like, or what do you mean, how do you get away with it?
I'm sorry?
In what sense do you mean you get away with it?
Well, I turn over a leaf on some years at least. There'll be a dozen leaf hoppers on there, and if I drive through my tractor to spray in midsummer, it's covered with leaf hoppers at the end of the day, but I don't see any damage, and I have a reasonable crop, and I'm getting away with that. How come?
So pest populations and pest damage are not necessarily correlated. And in some cases you can have, there's been a lot of studies where they have insects, where they'll primarily put them with predators, but I guess the same would be true with parasitoids, or even just having a lot of pests to begin with. Just because you have a lot of them there doesn't mean that they're actually able to feed and damage the crop. And there's some studies that have shown predators being able to interfere with the insects and kind of keep them on the run long enough where they're not actually, you don't actually have a spider eating these leafhoppers and reducing their population, but they're out there and they're bothering them and disturbing them so much that they're actually not able to really settle down, put that little needle mouth part they've got and start sucking out leaf content. That's just one idea. I mean, environmental conditions can also affect their ability to feed if it's very windy or something like that.
Just to comment on that.
Yeah.
In my experience, you can tolerate actually a pretty high level of leafhoppers and get away with it when it comes to ripening fruit bricks. A lot of times the nuisance factor, like you were mentioning, harvest time and stuff, ends up being one of the driving factors to control them.
Yeah.
And obviously nobody likes to see vines that really look bad, like they've really been chewed up. But
Yeah.
it's kind of surprising. I've seen some kind of extreme situations where vines can tolerate really high populations and still, not have a huge economic impact.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I have a really high population.
Yeah.
And secondly, they don't seem to be a problem in harvesting.
Yeah, Jason and I have worked on kind of determining nuisance thresholds, and IPM guides might recommend treating at 20 nibs per leaf or something along those lines, but we're seeing situations where you might get up to 60 and you don't treat it. It really just depends on your vineyard.
When they get in your ears,
Yeah.
that's when you spray.
They don't seem to be there.
Then you're probably below those thresholds that it's not a big
You
deal.
probably have good parasite activity.
We've got plenty of blackberries.
Yeah. But like you said, Daniel, the UC IPM threshold is 20 nymphs per leaf. That's at least in California. That was developed on, I think, table grapes, raised Thompson seedless or something like that. And in I've done some surveys with our growers in the North Coast and asked them, what are your treatment thresholds? It ranges from 0 to 2 to 20 to 100.
Yeah.
I don't care. I just want to treat it. I don't care. And
We pulled it off last year with a crop where you could stand in the vineyard and hear the leafhoppers. And we didn't treat.
Now, does Live allow, I'm in Region 1, and I don't know whether it's even allowable for me to spray for.
Yeah, it is. We can talk about that, especially after Al's presentation.
So,
yeah, Rick.
Houston, certainly in the red blotch regimen, we know we're vectors. They move around. But the fact that you found it, or we also found it as well in wild grapes, doesn't that just tell you there must be a vector moving it onto those wild grapes?
I mean, some of these wild grapes, yes, short answer. Longer answer, we know that there's some viruses, I think, that can be transmitted by pollen. And some of these wild grapes are really hybrids of kind of vinifera and californica. Just a theory, but I 2 years ago I came into this and said, there's no vector, and everybody around me is saying, no, there's no vector, it's all humans. And I'm more willing to believe there's an insect now. I don't think it's leafhoppers are one of these really common ones. We have more tests to do, but yeah, so that's the exciting part of this talk where I say, yeah, I think there's a vector. No, I don't know what it is, sorry, you know. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can have a situation where, as you've been implying, you can have multiple very inefficient vectors. You know, say there's one of these viruses that's circulative, you know, and that's a long process, and then the virus is lost during the insect life cycle, and then the leaf needs to be at the right physiological age to transmit the virus, and they need to feed for 3 hours or more for that to happen. You know, you add together all of those probabilities, you end up with lots of low probability things going on. And what moves vectors around the field are just all sorts of things that spook the organisms. One is the leaves just aren't too good for them to feed on, so they get mobile looking for a better place to feed. Another is you use something like a synthetic pyrethrum or an insecticide, or if you're, you know, or worse, kind of pyrethrum or one of the natural products. And that mobilizes insects. It has a peripheral nervous system thing that actually gets them moving around.
Yep.
So the things that we can do just increase mobility and you get more spread, and leaving things alone sometimes is the best thing to do. So this kind of smells of something that's to do with kind of low efficiency vectors in a system where it's rather unpredictable what the further conditions are.
Yeah. Yep. I hope to come back in a year or 2 years and say, voila, here, do this, you know. We're still very much in the process.
Okay, everybody, we're going to get back to it here because we're pushing up against our time limit. So all you folks doing business there in the back can do it afterward. Mary has a quick announcement before we get into Al's talk, so I'll let you introduce Al.
Hey, I'm with Mary Hall. I'm with the IPPC, and I know you're all interested in what the bugs are doing and not doing, and where the viruses are and not, but I'm really interested in what you all are going to be doing out on your vineyards or not doing as we launch this PSP. I'm a part of that project, so hopefully you'll see a little bit of me over time. I'm a little bit interested in the changes you might be doing, what the benefits of workshops are, programs that we do together. So I've handed out, or Rick handed out, a voluntary form. You do not have to fill this out. It would be very helpful if you did, and that as you leave, if you could check in with me. These would be confidential, but at the bottom I would put a code number and your name on a separate sheet of paper with the only reason of looking for repeat attendance over time. Nothing to do with you and your form. They're never near each other. That would just be my wish, is if you, when you leave, just hand it to me and we can kind of write down your name and keep track of who's here today. Okay. He's going to have to introduce himself. And if you didn't get one, I will.
Let's see, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. Well, my name's Al MacDonald, and as they alluded to earlier, I'm one of the founders of the Lime organization. I started in the Oregon wine industry in 1980 and planted a vineyard up in the Willamette Valley. It was called Seven Springs in 1982. And then in 1999, I started teaching viticulture at Chemeketa Community College. And last year, I retired from that and also retired from my vineyard. And now I do inspections for Live. I'm no longer involved with the day-to-day operations. But I want to just give a little bit of a history of Live, what it's about, why we're doing it, and I'm glad the other presentations came before mine because that's really the basis of what Live is all about. But in 1996, or about 20 years ago, might have been 1995, as you get older, you find out that you don't remember dates quite as well as you used to. We had a viticulturist at Oregon State University who had studied in Switzerland and invited Dr. Ernst Boller, who was the head of the research station in Waynesville, Switzerland, who was interested in, and he was also on the commission for the International Organization for Biological Control, or the IOBC, and he was in charge of the commission on regulations or suggestions on organizations that were interested in integrated production. So he came and gave a presentation at Oregon State University, and it was attended by a number of growers from the Willamette Valley, myself included. And after the presentation, the growers got together and sort of looked at each other and said, well, you know, that's what we do out in our vineyards. This looks like an interesting program, so we got together and decided, I wonder if we could do that here. So we wrote up, we had a working group that got together in 1997 in the Willamette Valley, and we came up with a checklist of items that Ernst had explained to us that they were using in Switzerland. And from this checklist, we actually had Porter Lombard, who's from down here, go around and inspect the vineyards based on the checklist that we came up with. And we had 26 volunteer vineyards at that time that were involved in the program. And we found out that everybody passed. Of course, there were only 26 items on the checklist at that time. And it included not just disease and pest control, but also fertilizer management, vineyard floor management, and all of the other aspects of integrated production. So in 1998, we decided, well, that was nice. You know, Porter went out and volunteered and inspected vineyards. And so what? You know, what's next? So we thought, well, wouldn't it be nice then, seeing that we can do this, and we've already proved that we can do this, if we could get some type of official recognition for following integrated production practices. So I contacted Ernst in Switzerland and said, well, as an organization, there's no one in the United States doing sustainable production certification. It was organic at the time, but nothing in the sustainable area. And I said, well, what would it take for you to endorse our organization as one that certifies vineyards for being sustainable? And he said, well, we have this whole list of things that you have to do in order to do that. One, you have to be a corporation. You have to have a corporate structure, a board of directors, bylaws, you know, the whole thing that you get with that type of organization. And you have to make an application for endorsement, be in existence for 2 years, be self-sufficient, you know, the whole organization. I says, well, sure, how hard could that be? So I flew to Switzerland for the weekend, and I met with Ernst, and he went over the whole thing, and I came back going, well, it might be a little bit more difficult than we thought, but let's give it a shot. Why would we do this? One, if we're already engaging in these types of practices and we can get some type of official recognition for it, then we can at least come up with something that we can tell our customers that, you know, like organic. We have this seal. We've been through this third-party certification, and we're following practices as the best we can. Now, this is a science-based program, and things are always changing. So today we have, at least from the website of last night or the night before, about 311 vineyards that are certified in the program, over 7,000 acres in a set aside for biodiversity, and 41 wineries participating in the program. So I'll kind of go through this. Our organization, we have a board of directors, which is all volunteer. You know, I press the right buttons here. No, I didn't. Okay. You'd never guess I taught for 15 years. I did this all the time too, and just see if students were awake. All right. So the Live organization does have a board of directors. It's run by volunteers. Everybody is a volunteer on this. We have We have two paid staff members. Our executive director, and Abby here, who's transitioning on to some other things. But we also have committees that we rely on quite heavily. We have a joint certification technical committee. We have a biodiversity working group. We have a vineyard certification checklist subcommittee and a winery certification technical committee. And each region also has a technical committee because we realize that growing conditions are different down here. They're different in Eastern Oregon, they're different in Washington, and they're different in the Willamette Valley. You have different problems in pests, and the things that are sustainable or make sense in your area are really area specific, as you probably learned from these other presentations. So that's the basis of the program. It's primarily a volunteer organization, and your dues and the money that's collected goes primarily to the either the executive director or we have third-party inspectors that are paid members or are paid to do the inspections. So other than that, no money goes to anything else other than educational materials and that type of thing. So what is the IOBC? The IOBC is the International Organization for Biological Control, and it's a global organization. And they have a nice little presentation, so I didn't duplicate that. But their mission and objectives is to promote research, development, and implementation of biological control and integrated pest management, and to focus on sustainable methods of control that are economically safe, or environmentally safe, economically feasible, that's another item of our program, and socially acceptable. So that is the basis of any definition of sustainability, that it has to contain all three of these elements. And so our program stresses not just pest management, but also if you're going to be doing something out in the vineyard, is it economically feasible to do that? And are you a part of your community, and how do you treat your workers, and that type of thing. So they are also a nonprofit scientific organization. You all can read this, so I'll just go through it quite quickly. And they provide us as an organization with independent and professional advice. And we're trying to raise public awareness of the economic and social importance of our biological control in our IPM programs. The IOBC also promotes international cooperation. They have a number of working groups and commissions. The Commission on Regulations is the one that Ernst was involved in. And they have a number of meetings and symposia throughout the year. And they help facilitate training in biological control. Again, I'm going through this kind of fast, but that's all right. They have a website. You can go to it if you're interested in more of this information. Biological control is very important. This is a global organization. The only one that had set standards for organizations that do certifications. It was the one in Europe, so that's why we partnered with them. But they do have organizations in the other regions, North America, Asia, and in those different areas. The difference between this and other types of organization is that their working groups are crop-based. So they're involved in citrus, olives, viticulture, and so that's the focus of our program. We were also involved in viticulture. Also, they deal with other things and have suggestions for that. And they're also pest focused, so they look at plant pathogens and other pests that you might have. They put out publications. They're calling for membership. Again, this is their presentation here. So that is in essence the IOBC and why we partnered with them to get their approval of our organization so that we wouldn't just be setting standards as grape growers in Oregon and defining what sustainability is. We wanted to do something at a higher level than that to approve the things that we were doing. It'd be like, we didn't want to be the used car salesman that said, I certified this car because I checked it out and it stopped when I drove it in the lot, so I know the brakes work. So we actually have an overseeing organization that has to approve all of our rules and regulations and procedures. So moving along here. That one. That's what the ILBC is. And they have laid out our guidelines for endorsement, and this is what we've been following as far as integrated production and how we've set up our checklist. How many people have been to the live website or are familiar with it? Okay, so when you go to the live website, it's all of the information that's on there is actually derived from this document, which is the IB, or Integrated Production Guidelines and Endorsement. And this is where we got all of those regulations. And I just want to scroll down here pretty quick just to show you where some of the things come from. I know it'll make you dizzy when I do this, but as you can see, it's quite detailed, but basically it involves traceability, self-evaluation, biological diversity in the landscape. Those are all major headings of the different things on our score sheet. So we have, the way it's set up is that there are a number of things that are required under integrated production, and those are red list items on our score sheet. There are a number of things that should be done, and those are yellow items on our score sheet, and then there are a number of ecological options. But you can see here, we have at least 5 ecological options. So one of the things that integrated production or the LIVE program requires is just 5% ecological compensation area set aside. And I think if you saw from the last presentation that the overwintering predatory insects that you want in your vineyard need these other habitats in order to be effective in the vineyard. And a lot of times it's how far away are they? And so on the farm level that we're dealing with here in the LIVE program, we require that you have at least some of that on your farm. And so that's a very important aspect. Another thing that you probably looked at, if you've seen our website, is that we have a list of plant control measures, and those are divided into the green, yellow, and I don't think we have a red list on there, but the red list is essentially things that you're not supposed to do. Again, I'll scroll down through this a little bit slower because Abby did a really good job of presenting that. But this was the guideline that was set out by the ILBC, and we have, for any particular pest problem that you might have, we have green preferred options. So, for instance, if you're talking about the leafhoppers that you were here, one of the things that they just did the study on was, flowering, what plants out there will attract the parasitoid wasps and blackberries. Somebody just took all out of them, or maybe somebody has them, but so that might be on the green list. That's something you can do that doesn't require chemical pesticide. So if you can have a refuge, the prune trees, or whatever it is, that's something that doesn't have a negative impact on the environment as long as it's under control. The yellow list options are usually direct control measures, which usually are chemical in nature or pesticide based. So you only use chemical or direct control measures when your green control measures do not work. All right. So that's the flow chart, the basic flow chart of how LIVE works or integrated production works, and basically how it's set up. So I'll just kind of move on here. And then we have a list of what we call approved pesticides, and I'll get to that in a minute as we discuss how we decide which pesticides are used in the program, and then I'll do an update for this year. So how are control measures determined? According to the IOBC, we have control measures that are permitted, control measures that are permitted with restrictions, and then control measures that are not permitted under consideration. So the first thing is, when we have a control measure, is it toxic to humans or mammals? I mean, you don't want some control measure out in your vineyard, you don't want to spray arsenic or something, you know. So we have to consider, when we're considering a direct control measure, its toxicity to the workers. The toxicity to key or natural pests. I think they talked about some broad spectrum pesticides out there. Dan was talking about that. You go out and spray. The first thing you do is you knock out all your beneficials. And then if your beneficials aren't there, then your pest species, which are more resilient, can become more of a problem. So if we're looking at a direct control measure, the next item we look at is how toxic is it to our natural beneficials or natural enemies. And then is it toxic to other natural organisms out there? And one of the ones that is getting a lot of attention lately are pollinators. You know, grapevines don't normally use pollinators, so we're not really too worried about bees in our vineyard, but our neighbors might be, and actually the bee decline is becoming a very big national issue at this point, so we don't want to be contributing to the decline in pollinators. So that's another thing that we look at when we look at direct control or pesticide that we might be using in the vineyard. Pollution potential. So if we're going to use a direct control method, how likely is it to persist in the soil? Is it going to get into the water system? One thing that we found out a few years ago, or in our partnership with Salmon Safe, is that copper it gets into the environment rather easily through erosion and other rainfall type events. And even minute amounts of copper can have a very detrimental effect on salmon navigation. In other words, the young salmon with copper in their system swim around in circles. It doesn't kill them, but they can't head out to sea. All right. So we banned copper because, at least in our region, because there's no pest that we could use it on that would justify its use. Copper-based pesticides are used primarily for downy mildew, which is not much of a problem here on the West Coast, at least not yet. Other things that we look at is their ability to stimulate pests and diseases. We know that, for instance, if we're using a lot of sulfur, sulfur is also a miticide. If we're using sulfur for mildew control, and we're using excesses of amounts of sulfur, we can end up with more mite problems. And that's very common in organic vineyards. So again, there's limits on the use of certain direct control measures. There's selectivity. If we're going to use a direct control measure, we want it to attack the pest or disease that we're trying to target and not be a broad spectrum. And again, they talked about that in the earlier presentation. So there's selectivity, persistence, and we're not just talking about insect pests, we're also talking about weeds, and we're talking about fertilizers and that type of thing too. So how long do they persist in the environment? I mean, there are some herbicides, for instance, that are used that can last in the soil for 15 or 20 years. And make it very difficult then if you're trying to establish other types of cropping systems to do that. And the potential, and this is becoming more and more an issue, and something I'll talk about here at the end, because there's some pesticides that we're using that are very susceptible to the target pests developing resistance to it. And that's really the problem with trying to rely primarily on chemical control of any pest or disease, is that eventually the pest or disease that you're trying to treat with a specific chemical is going to develop some resistance to that chemical. And that's why we're always getting new chemicals on the market, because the old ones are no longer working anymore. So if we can do things to reduce the potential for resistance development, we'll select those chemicals for our yellow list. All right. Other things we look at is if some new product comes out on the market and we don't have any information on it, or it's missing, we can't recommend it. So there was a lot of new products that came out in the last few years that only had manufacturers' data on. But with only manufacturers' data, it's really kind of hard to recommend whether we can use those or not. So and the other is the necessity of use. I think somebody here mentioned that, I've got leafhoppers all over, I don't treat for them, there's no problem, so why spray? Yeah, okay. Because it doesn't look good, or maybe just next to the winery where the people walk out with their glass of wine and they don't want all those bugs in the wine glass, that kind of looks at it. But you can always spin that another way. Well, look at all the diversity in protein sources. We're not, those are vegetarian bugs. All right, whatever. You can always spin it two ways. Weed management, as far as possible, should be, this is another recommendation. And again, this is the kind of thing that comes out of the ILBC is they'll state something like this: weed management should be achieved as far as possible by non-chemical controls. Does that mean you can't spray Roundup? No, but if you have, so what we do is we encourage other alternatives to that, all right? And then we put limits on it. Yeah, you can spray Roundup, but only once or only twice. And that'll be up to your regional technical committee to make those kind of recommendations. And the other thing that they're very insistent on is chemical soil disinfection or sterilization is not allowed. And if you think of it, the soil is not just dirt. It's a living organism. There's all kinds of things in the soil that you want to promote. It's probably the most biologically diverse thing on your farm is what's in the soil. And if you chemically sterilize the soil, and we have issues with that, particularly in replanting on the east side over there, where we've had to deal with that because they have large nematode populations building up, and they want to nuke their soil. Was that the best thing to do, and how do we work with that? So those are things that do come out and are considered, and those come from the technical guidelines from the ILBC. And where the risk of resistance against plant protection measures is known, and this is a thing we've been dealing with lately, and requires repeated application now with powdery mildew, which is the biggest problem, is a big problem in the Willamette Valley. It's probably a problem down here. It's a problem worldwide. And you're spraying for powdery mildew mostly proactively because you don't want it. By the time you get it, it's too late to treat. And so the products that we're using also have a very high probability of resistance development. Is that we have to look at those products and set regional guidelines. And again, they're not. The ILBC doesn't tell us what to do specifically. It's our technical committee that has to look at these products and figure out the best solution for each growing area for the effectiveness of these products. Any questions so far? Kind of going fast here because I know it's pretty nice out. So how do we pick the pesticides that we use? Again, we prefer that you don't use any, if possible. But we're not an organic organization. And let me tell you, the organic organizations also use pesticides. They're just natural pesticides. So the technical committees actually go to many different sources. The ILBC puts out a pesticide list. We'll see if we get that here. And this is an example of that. All of this is online. I just got it off there so I could show you this. But they have a list of active ingredients over here on this side, code number, whether it's an insecticide, fungicide, acaricide, herbicide, plant growth regulator, typical formulations, and rates. And then over here, whether it's toxic to predatory mites, spiders, flower bugs, lacewings. So a lot of your predatory complex is included in this list, and even up to earthworms and fish, ground beetles, or whatever. So if we take one here, I don't know if there's any here we use. These are mostly acaricides here, but if we were to select one, we see that this one is quite toxic to our predatory mites, and if that's a major predatory mite that we want in the vineyard to attack some of the plant-feeding mites we have there, then this wouldn't be a good choice. And so this is just one of the things that the technical committee looks at. So they look at this list from the ILBC. We also look at Salmon Safe. We are partners with Salmon Safe, so that if you do become live certified, you're automatically Salmon Safe certified. We've incorporated their guidelines into our guidelines, so you sort of get two for the price of one, if you will. But they have a high risk list, and they're a little bit more concerned about pesticides, and here's a list of pesticides they consider high risk to salmon, especially if they get into the stream beds. So if it's on this high risk list, but there's some reason you have to use it in your vineyard, then we'll have to look at how far are you from a stream, a salmon-bearing stream, or how likely is it to get into the watershed, and could you use it on a limited basis, but we wouldn't list it as something that you could automatically use. It would have to be on an individual basis. So it's not saying you can't use some of these if you have an emergency. The thing is, if you're too close to a salmon-bearing waterway, probably you can't use it. All right? But also, if it's quite toxic to your predatories, that might not work. Another thing that that they also look at, and part of what Dan Jepsen is using there is he has a pesticide risk mitigation engine, which is called PRIME, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get your exact location, and then they get a list of pesticides, and they try to find out the risk, the applications of those pesticides in a particular area. And I don't know if this is going to show up big enough down here, but this is their little flyer, how it would be with different species of pollinators or predatory or other insects that you might have. And this is site specific. So this is still in development, but it's something that the technical committees would also use. Then the technical committees would just do an internet search to see if anybody has done any research, university-based research on any of the pesticides that we might want to use, and any new information. So as you can see, then these are ongoing things, and they're going to change from year to year. So what the technical committee will do as far as pesticide use, and the pesticide list changes from year to year as new information becomes available. We might have a less toxic alternative, or we might have a new pest or disease that needs to be controlled. And once we run it through at least 3 or 4 of these different pesticide assessment tools, we can make a best judgment on which would be the most specific to the target pest, cause the least environmental damage, and it might have to be used in a very specific manner. I think the one for cutworms in Washington, and Region 2, actually this is Region 2, you could only spray it on the trucks, for instance, instead of broadcasting it over the ground. Okay, so that, there's a lot of work that goes into that. I'll give a little update, and then we'll have maybe 15 minutes or so for questions. So we use all of these. What's will be, let's see if I can get this, yeah. Frac 11 fungicides are going to be not approved or not listed on the yellow list starting in 2017, and this includes I will go back to the other one. Your strobilurums. We're finding evidence now from Oregon State that there are too many mildew isolates out there that are resistant to the strobilurums and that they're no longer effective. So this is one where effectiveness is a major thing. Another one that we're taking off the list effective this year is Pristine. This is a bundled one, but it contains an ingredient that they found in Europe that is quite toxic. Maybe Abby can help me here.
Yeah, it's been on the salmon safe high hazard
All right,
list.
so yeah, it's a salmon safe.
And I think it had some risk for soil dwelling organisms as well. And the technical committee was reviewing available options for that pest and felt there were better ones with lower risks.
All right. So again, I haven't been in the technical committee for a while, so I'm not updated on all the reasoning. I just know they are well reasoned and scientific and research based. So looking ahead then, if you're looking at the FRAC 11 and the strobilurums, you can't recommend them because they don't work. They may work, but who knows. Movento, another one that was allowed in Region 2, is only allowed for mealybugs and scale. There are some that are actually organic approved, but they're not approved in live. Hydrogen peroxide oxidate, which is a contact mildew, supposedly eradicant, probably not very effective. It's extremely harmful to the applicators. And then, as I explained earlier, copper is not allowed in the live system, yet it's allowed in the organic system, primarily because they don't have as many tools in their toolbox that we do. And just another reminder that just because something is listed on the Organic Material Review Institute or is OMRI listed doesn't necessarily mean it's live approved. So we've had a number of people that said, well, it's organic approved, why can't I just apply it in live? Well, there are a number of organic insecticides, for instance, that are broad spectrum, that you can spray your oils or whatever, your pyrethroids. They kill everything out there. They're organic because they're natural based, but they're not part of the integrated approach. So, and also they would, just because they're OMRI listed doesn't necessarily mean that they're also approved in organic production without restrictions. Certain copper formulations are organically approved, but they're organically approved with restrictions. So there's a lot of people that think, well, it's organic approved, I'm not organic, so I can just go out and spray as much as I want. Well, if you were certified organic, you would be in violation of the organic guidelines also. And we're looking more and more at some of the protection for pollinators. Again, that's the big issue here, and you're going to hear a lot more in the United States. Oregon has some problems with that. Nobody wants to spray their trees and have all the bees or pollinators die. So here are some of the products, and Abby sent this out as an email. Did everybody get that? Did you all read it? You're supposed to read those when you send it out? All right. Well, that's why we're reinforcing it here, because if you do use these products in violation of the restrictions, then you threaten your certification. So it just, at the beginning of every growing season, it's very good to just go over what new changes there are and what things are allowed this year. And if there's ever a question, you should contact either a member of your technical committee or the live office, just to make sure. I know that certification, although some people think it's quite expensive, is really one of the cheaper certification programs out there, or the least expensive certification programs out there, but you don't want some minor infractions to jeopardize your certification. So, usually they're quite responsive. Some other pollinator protections, there's some of the things on the list there. And we're looking at toxicity to bees and other pollinators and non-target insects. Again, when we went back to that other slide, that was one of the criteria we used when we select pesticides for the pesticide list, is its effect on non-target organisms. And a big emphasis on our biodiversity. Even the simple things like our fatty acids and insecticidal soaps have restrictions. So I guess we're also looking at, technical committees are looking at the bicarb, which are radicant mildew mildicides for next season. Yeah.
Could you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so your oils and your fatty acids are non-selective. All right, so again, if you're going to be using those, you have to do it when non-target organisms are not present in your spray zones. I think Dan was talking about, that sprayer stuff that was going out there. Lyme looks at a lot of different things, and we give extra credit if you were to get more advanced sprayer technology. One of the things that we're using up in the Willamette Valley is now they're using those hooded sprayers, which can recapture and the wind, then because vineyards are not trees, and you can actually get a sprayer that'll go over the vine and capture all the drift and recycle it. You can reduce your chemical usage considerably that way. And you can spray today when there's no wind, all right? And you can spray when it is windy because everything is tinted. So a lot of times if you're living in a windy area, which we do, I lived in the Eola Hills, and it was much windier in the Eola Hills than it was in the Dundee Hills. And we couldn't spray after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, just because the wind would come up over 30 miles an hour by that time of the afternoon. So that meant a lot of night spraying or early morning spraying. And again, the humidity levels might not have been, so that would have been a solution to that type of thing. I had a lot to cover here. Any question about it? All right, and that's the end of my slides. We've only got about 10 minutes or so. Yes?
Forgive me if you covered this, but would you care to elaborate at all on chemical rotations as a part of it?
Resistance management. All right. And so one of the things that we know causes resistance to, or how pests develop resistance is if the same chemical with the same mode of action is used repeatedly. Because there's always some population in the pest genotype there that is resistant to a chemical. And if you, with powdery mildew, if you have a chemical that prevents 90% of the spores from sporulating, but 10% are resistant to it, and you knock out the other 90%, you've just made a nice home for the other 10%. And so if you use that same chemical over and over again, pretty soon all you're going to have is resistant populations of the pests out there. And the same applies for insect pests too. So that's the resistance management. So we recommend that you always rotate a spray with another spray with a different mode of action, and that's where the FRAC code comes in, which is your fungicide. Anything with the same number is in the same group and it'll have the same resistance. So just because it's a different brand name doesn't mean it's a different mode of action. Coke and Pepsi is still cola. RC in there, you don't want to get through it. Yeah.
Has FRAC 11 resistance shown up in all the growing areas of Oregon?
That's what Walt Mahaffey was saying, yes.
Everywhere.
Yeah, he's found it in Washington, Willamette Valley, down here.
Down here, it's in every vineyard they tested. I know you're saying it's still pretty effective at your place, and that
It might well be effective at your place as long as you're rotating your chemicals, but eventually you're going to get a resistant population build up.
Well, it's just not my vineyard, the whole General Valley, we haven't seen resistance, and that's why I was asking.
Well, if you think powdery mildew spores, they're everywhere. They're in the air. We're breathing them in right now. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be region-wide. Okay. So they can travel a long ways. Yes?
Yep.
do have a question, but since we're wrapping up, I did want to remind everyone, Mary mentioned the survey, so please fill that out. That information is helpful for us. It is confidential. And also, I do have extra copies of this drift handout, both in English and Spanish, if you want to grab some on the way out. Back there. But you mentioned with the using the neonicotinoids in the drip system, that as long as you tried an alternative before and it hadn't been effective, do you have to try the alternative that season, or could you have tried it like the previous year or 2 years ago and it hadn't worked, and this is really the only effective treatment you have available? How do you assess that?
Well, that's a good question. And with the neonics, what we're concerned about that with the pollinators primarily, but also, you know, eventually it's probably one of those that are going to be banned anyway. It's already being banned in Europe. But if you have a pest problem, one of the things that lab requires is you have very accurate records taken. So if you've done another application of something and you've got the records for that, then talk to your technical committee chair to see where to go next. All right? So,
Yeah, if you had said, if you could show us that, oh, I tried applaud last year, and I tried these cultural techniques, I tried applaud last year, I tried this other oil last year, and I'm really concerned, and so I'm going in early with a neonic this year, I think you'd have no problem. Yeah. As long as you could show that you were working towards it, which is part of the live requirement anyways, is to document your process and to really apply these green and yellow, you know, you work up to, okay, now I have sort of, you limit yourself through fulfilling all these other options first.
right, and usually, you know, if the timing's right and the counts are right and the application's right, they should work, but they don't always, all right? So, again, economic viability is very important. I should say this is a voluntary program. Nobody is, we're not forcing anybody to do it. I know a lot of the wineries are requesting that growers join because this is what they want to impress in their marketing program, is that we are a sustainable thing. For those that aren't interested, all of our information is online. It's transparent. If there's only part of it you want to use, that's fine. You know, as far as we're concerned, as long as we're advancing sustainability in some way, it doesn't always have to be by certification. So that's why everything's up there. That's why all the information is free and it's available. If you go through it and you say, I'm really close, I could do that, but I don't want to come up with the $200 or whatever it is. But I talked to my winery and he said they would front me that, and we've had wineries that were willing to do that because if their winery is certified and they want to use it, they have to have the fruit. So, you know, a lot of times there's other ways around that, but it's really not that expensive in the long run, because in the long run it should actually save you money if you follow those guidelines.
Yeah, the standards are there's a farm plan in place, so it's kind of a nice reference point. You can look at their entire plan for any kind of pest.
Right.
It's
And
just a
so,
good reference.
yeah, it's out there. You know, and as extension is tighter and tighter all the time, this is just another source of information where you can get a little bit more a broader overview of what's going on in this particular industry. The other thing is, what that's live is different than, say, organic, is that we require the entire farm to be part of the program in order to get certified. And that's a little bit different than the organic. You can have an organic field and do conventional farming on the other, you know, right next door. But because of the ecosystem aspect of it, has to include the entire farm. And we've even defined what that is. So that's there. So any other questions? I know that I went through that kind of quick, and there's just a lot of, I can't give you 25 years of information in 45 minutes, but I think it's a good program. It's worked for us. It's grown from the original 26 people that up to now over 400 people that are actually certified in it. We've spurred certification programs around the country. Long Island, New York has one. California has a couple of certification programs. We were the first in the country. We're number one, Oregon. We have certification programs in other, I guess there's other places too. New Zealand, for instance, came after us, but in order to be part of their national marketing program, you have to be certified sustainable in New Zealand if you want to market your wine through their national wine program. So there are aspects to it. And, I think it's been good for the Oregon wine industry. Again, even if you don't want to join, the information is there, and we would encourage you to just look at it, see how close you can be. The only thing is you have to be inspected once every 3 years, and you have to keep records, but the records you should be keeping anyway. I'm an inspector, and I haven't had any problem with any inspections. I did quite a few of them down here last year, and it seems like most people can do it. So.
Great, Al, thank you so much for sharing that history and overview of the program.